a billionaire in a silk blouse, a mechanic in grease-stained coveralls. One jet, one impossible challenge. She pointed at a multi-million-dollar Gulfstream and said, "In front of everyone, fly this jet. We'll talk." The crowd laughed. He didn't. He looked at the aircraft, looked back at her, and said two words that changed everything. What she didn't know, what nobody knew, was who this man really was, and what it cost him to walk away from the sky. This is his story. If you're new here, subscribe right now. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. And when we're done today, drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Hit the like button too, it helps more than you know. Stay with me, because this one goes deep. The alarm went off at 4:47 in the morning, same as every day, and Ethan Mercer lay still for exactly 3 seconds before his feet hit the cold floor. Because he needed 3 seconds to wake up. He'd been awake for an hour already, staring at the ceiling in the dark, listening to the sound of Noah breathing through the thin wall between their bedrooms. He did that sometimes. Just listened. Made sure the breathing was there. It always was. But he checked anyway. The apartment was small, a 2-bedroom on the 2nd floor of a complex in Elk Grove Village, Illinois, close enough to O'Hare that you could hear planes on certain wind directions if the windows were open. Ethan never opened that window. He told himself it was because of the noise. He'd been telling himself that for 3 years. He moved quietly through the kitchen, filled the coffee maker, set it to brew, and then packed Noah's lunch the way he always did. Turkey sandwich on whole wheat, cut diagonally because Noah went through a phase at 7 where he said rectangles tasted wrong, and even though Noah was 9 now and probably didn't care anymore, Ethan still cut it the same way. Some habits are harder to explain than they are to break. He wrote a note on a Post-it and stuck it to the fridge. Afternoon care until 6. Mrs. Daly has the key. Call me if you need anything. He folded it back up. He hadn't needed to write that. Knew the routine. But Ethan wrote it anyway. By 5:30, he was in his truck, thermos between his knees, headlights cutting through the dark February morning. The private aviation facility where he worked, Meridian Air Services, sat about 40 minutes west of the city on a stretch of flat Illinois land that was exactly as unromantic as it sounds. Hangars, tarmac, a small administrative building with bad fluorescent lighting, and a fleet of private jets that belonged to people who didn't know his name and didn't particularly want to. That was fine with Ethan. He wasn't there to be known. He was there to work. Meridian Air Services catered exclusively to corporate clients, hedge fund managers, pharmaceutical executives, a handful of tech founders who'd rather have their own aircraft than deal with commercial terminals. The facility was clean, professional, and mostly quiet. Ethan had been there 4 years, working as a senior aircraft mechanic, and in that time he'd built a reputation for 2 things: thorough inspections and almost no conversation. His supervisor, a heavy-set man named Dave Kowalski, who'd been in aviation maintenance for 22 years, once described Ethan to a new hire as the kind of guy you want looking at your plane, but don't expect to grab a beer with. It wasn't meant unkindly. It was just accurate. Ethan showed up early. He left on time. He never missed a safety item. He never filed a shortcut. And when something didn't feel right to him, a pressure reading, a sound during a pre-flight checks, something in the logbook that technically cleared inspection, but sat wrong in his gut, he flagged it, documented it, and wouldn't sign off until it was resolved. That had made him unpopular exactly twice in 4 years, both times with clients who'd already filed flight plans and didn't appreciate delays. Both times, Ethan's concerns were later validated by further inspection. He didn't say anything about that either time. He just went back to work. He didn't need credit. He just needed the planes to not fall out of the sky. The morning of February 14th started like any other. Ethan arrived at 6:10, changed into his coveralls in the locker room dark navy blue, worn soft from 200 washings, stitched above the left breast pocket, and was elbow deep in the auxiliary power unit of an apartment 350 by 630. The APU had been throwing intermittent fault codes for the past week. Nothing catastrophic, but intermittent was exactly the word that kept Ethan up at night. Intermittent meant the problem was hiding. He liked problems he could see. Problems that hid were the ones that killed people. Kowalski appeared at the hangar bay door around 8, looking mildly harassed, which was his default setting. "We got a situation," he said. Ethan didn't look up from the compartment. "What kind?" "Whitmore Aerospace. Their Gulfstream came in last night for a scheduled service, supposed to leave this morning. Their chief pilot, Harrison, you know Harrison? I know of him. He had a cardiac event last night. They took him to Northwestern. He's stable, but he's not flying anywhere." Ethan pulled his head out of the compartment and looked at Kowalski. "That's rough." "Yeah, well." Kowalski shifted his weight. "Whitmore is here. Flew in from New York last night. She's got a government meeting in Washington this afternoon, some kind of aerospace policy thing, at the DOT. She needs to get there, and she's not happy about the situation. She's allowed to not be happy about it. She's making everybody else not happy about it. That's the problem." Ethan reached for a rag, wiped his hands and went back to work. "She can charter something. There are regional operators who can—" "She doesn't want a charter. She wants her plane." Kowalski paused. "She's apparently very particular." "That's her right." Kowalski was quiet for a second too long. Ethan looked up again. "What?" "She's been asking around about who on staff has flight experience." Ethan went very still. "I know," Kowalski said, reading his face. "I didn't say anything. But she's already talked to 2 of the other guys." And they pointed her toward. The word was flat. Not angry. Just final, Ethan. He turned back to the APU compartment. "I'm a mechanic, Dave. I work here as a mechanic. Get her a charter. Call Midwest Executive Air. They can turn around a crew in 2 hours." I told her that. She told her again. Kowalski sighed, rubbed the back of his neck, and walked away. Ethan went back to work. He found the fault. 20 minutes later, a hairline crack in a seal that had been expanding and contracting with temperature cycles, enough to fail on any individual flight, but enough that it would eventually fail at altitude, probably at the worst possible moment. He photographed it, documented it, and flagged the aircraft for grounding. He was writing up the maintenance report when he heard the heels. Sloane Whitmore was not what most people expected when they imagined a 30-year-old running a $2 billion aerospace corporation. She wasn't loud. She didn't wave her hands. She had the specific kind of controlled energy that comes from someone who learned very early that composure is its own form of power, who discovered that the quieter you are, the more carefully people listen, because they're not sure what's coming next. She walked into the hangar like she owned it, which technically she did not, but nobody moved to tell her that. She was in a slate gray blazer, dark trousers, her dark hair pulled back cleanly, and she moved with the efficiency of someone who did not experience unscheduled time as anything other than waste. Behind her was her assistant, a young man named Garrett, who was carrying a tablet and an expression that suggested he'd had a very long morning. 3 of the Meridian executives followed at a slight distance: VP of Client Relations, Head of Ground Operations, and somebody whose title Ethan didn't know. Yes, he'd know. They all had the body language of people desperately trying to appear calm in the presence of a client who could pull a significant contract without making a phone call. Sloane stopped in the middle of the hangar and looked around. Her eyes found Ethan. He was crouched beside the Challenger, working on documentation, not looking at her. "You," she said. He looked up. "I've been told you have aviation experience beyond your current role," she said. It wasn't a question. It was the statement arranged to sound like a question, which was a different thing. Ethan straightened slowly. He was 6 feet tall, broad across the shoulders, and in the navy coveralls with grease on his forearms and a pencil behind his ear. He looked exactly like what he was, a man who worked with his hands for a living. "I work here as a mechanic," he said. "I maintain aircraft." "That's not what I asked. With respect, it's the most accurate answer I can give you." Something shifted in Sloane's expression. "Not much. Just a narrowing of focus. My chief pilot is in a hospital. I have a critical meeting in Washington in 5 hours. My aircraft is fueled and ready. I need someone who can fly it." She held his gaze. "Can you fly it?" The hangar was quiet in the particular way that spaces get quiet when everyone in them is pretending not to listen. Ethan looked at her for a moment. Then he glanced at the Gulfstream G550, sitting in the far bay white with dark blue accent stripes, Whitmore Aerospace logo on the tail. He'd done the pre-service inspection on it 2 nights ago. Exactly what condition it was in. "I work here as a mechanic," he said again. I'd recommend calling a charter service. Sloane's chin tilted slightly. I've been told charter crews can't turn around in time to make my meeting. 2 hours is tight, but I don't have 2 hours. She said it simply, dramatically, just as a fact. I have 1 hour before I need to be airborne. Then I'd suggest you call the FAA and request a window extension on. I don't need suggestions. Her voice hadn't risen, but something in it had sharpened. I need a pilot. One of the Meridian's executives, the VP of Client Relations, a man named Paulson, stepped forward with the particular nervousness of someone trying to intervene before a situation became a different, worse situation. Ms. Whitmore, our colleague Ethan here, is a valued member of our maintenance team. I'm sure if we reach out to, can he fly? She didn't look at Paulson. She was still looking at Ethan. Well, there are certain certifications we'd need to verify before we could officially. Can he fly? She repeated. And this time, it wasn't even a question. It was just the question, stripped down. Ethan looked at her. He thought about Noah, asleep in the apartment at 5:30 this morning, breathing steady through the wall. He thought about Julian. He thought about the way the Gulfstream had looked during his pre-service inspection, clean, properly maintained, everything in order. He'd signed off on it himself. I worked as an aircraft mechanic before coming here, he said. That's what I do. Something crossed Sloane's face then. It might have been impatience. It might have been something sharper. She turned to look at the Gulfstream, then back at him. Fly this jet, she said, and she said it loudly enough that everyone in the hangar could hear. Fly this jet. Then we'll talk. There was a moment. From somewhere behind the executives, one of the linemen laughed. It was a short laugh, quickly swallowed, but it was there. Someone else made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was clearly in the same family. The Meridian VP of Client Relations looked mortified. Ethan stood very still. He held Sloane's gaze. Then he looked at the Gulfstream again, the way a man looks at something. He knows intimately, not with longing, not with excitement, just with recognition. The way you look at a tool you've used 10,000 times. He looked back at her. Okay, he said. I'll fly it. The laughter stopped. The first thing Ethan did was call Mrs. Daly. He made the call outside the hangar, away from the executives and the cameras and Sloane Whitmore's controlled composure. Mrs. Daly was a retired teacher who lived 3 apartments down from them and had been Noah's emergency contact since they moved in. She answered on the second ring. Morning, Ethan. Morning. I have a situation at work. Is there any chance you can be at the school by 3 today? I don't know how late I'll be. A pause. He could hear her TV in the background. Of course. You okay? Yeah. Work thing. I'll explain later. You don't have to explain anything. I'll be there at 3. I said hi. I will. Thank you, Linda. He hung up. Then he stood outside for a moment, in the cold February air, and looked at the sky. It was low and gray and flat, the kind of mid-western winter sky that presses down on everything like a ceiling you can't push against. The forecast was a cold front moving through the Great Lakes region, crosswinds at moderate levels over most of Ohio and Pennsylvania, clearing by the time they'd reached the mid-Atlantic corridor. He'd already mapped it in his head. He always did that, even when he wasn't flying. It was a habit too old to break. He went back inside. Sloane's first officer was a young man named Miles Barrett, 26, maybe 27, with the precise haircut and the careful posture of someone who graduated near the top of his flight training class and knew it, was standing beside the Gulfstream doing his pre-flight checks when Ethan appeared in the cockpit door. Miles turned. He looked at the coveralls, at the grease on Ethan's forearms that hadn't entirely come off with washing, at the pencil still behind Ethan's ear, because Ethan had forgotten it was there. You're the captain? Miles said, not rudely, but not warmly either. Just the flattest possible delivery of a question. For today, Ethan said. Miles nodded slowly. Do you have current type ratings for the G550? I have type ratings. Ethan moved past him into the cockpit and settled into the left seat with the ease of someone sitting down at a desk they've worked at for years. When were these avionics last calibrated? Miles blinked. 6 weeks ago. It's in the maintenance log. Yeah, I know. I did the pre-service inspection Tuesday night. I saw the date. Ethan was already scanning the instrument panel, not rushing, just moving through it systematically, the way a musician runs through scale. There's a slight lag on the left altimeter cross-check. Stays within tolerance, but it's at the edge of the spec. I noted it in the write-up. Did Harrison know about it? Miles stared at him. How did you... It's in the maintenance notes I submitted Wednesday morning. Ethan looked at him. Did Harrison know about it or not? Yes. He flagged it for the next service interval. Okay. Ethan turned back to the panel. Pull up the ATIS for Dulles, and let me know when you're ready for the pre-departure checklist. Miles stood in the cockpit doorway for another 2 seconds. Yes, he'd intervened. Then he sat down in the right seat and started pulling up the weather information. And he didn't say anything else about the coveralls. Ethan came back down the air stair briefly to sign the final release paperwork. And that's when he saw Noah's post-it note in his jacket pocket, the one he'd stuck there this morning without thinking, the backup copy of the note on the refrigerator. He stood on the tarmac with it in his hand for a second. No, call me if you need anything. He put it back in his pocket. Sloane Whitmore was standing 20 feet away, talking quietly with Garrett, who was rapidly reorganizing whatever the Washington meeting logistics looked like. Now, she glanced at Ethan. He didn't look back at her. He signed the release paperwork, handed it to the ground agent, and went back up the stairs. The door sealed. The APU whirred to life. Miles ran through the checklist efficiently, and with good discipline, Ethan would give him that. Whatever skepticism he'd walked into the cockpit with, Miles Barrett kept it out of his work, which was the right call. The cockpit was not a place for feelings, or rather, it was a place where feelings had to sit in the back row and keep quiet. The clearance came through from Chicago Departure Control, cleared to Dulles International, initial climb to 8,000. Departure heading 230. Ethan read it back. His voice on the radio was different than the voice he used on the ground. Louder. Not more confident, he was plenty confident on the ground. Supped, seemed. It was more like the difference between the way you walk down a crowded street and the way you walk into a room where you know exactly where everything is. Easier, more settled. Miles noticed. He didn't say anything, but he noticed. They pushed back at 9:47. The Gulfstream taxied out with the fluid, unhurried movement of an aircraft that was well maintained and being handled by someone who understood its weight, and Ethan brought it through the turns onto the runway with an economy of motion that Davkolsky, watching from the hangar door across the field, described later to a colleague as weird to watch, because it didn't look like anything at all, and that's not how most pilots taxi. The tower cleared them for takeoff. Ethan pushed the throttles forward, and the G550's 2 Rolls-Royce engines answered with a sound like controlled inevitability. The aircraft the kind of accelerated with a straightforwardness that only shows up when the person at the controls is not working, is just flying. Rotation. The nose lifted. The wheels left the tarmac. Gray Midwestern sky swallowed the aircraft in 30 seconds. The cabin of a Gulfstream G550 is designed for people who consider comfort a reasonable expectation at 33,000 feet wide leather seats, polished wood trim, indirect lighting. Sloane was seated at the forward conference table with her laptop open, Garrett across from her, and she was approximately 30 seconds into reviewing briefing materials for the Washington meeting when she became aware that the aircraft was doing something she'd never quite felt before. It was difficult to describe. It wasn't that it was smoother than usual. It was that it felt deliberate. Like every adjustment, every tiny correction against the winter air was happening before she felt it rather than in response to it. Like someone was reading the weather rather than reacting to it. She looked up from her screen. She looked toward the cockpit door. She went back to her briefing materials. She lasted about 4 minutes. Ethan felt the weather change before the instruments caught it. A shift in the air pressure across the nose, a slight roughness in the way the aircraft was climbing through 18,000 feet. The kind of subtle vibration that most pilots would classify as normal turbulence and make a passenger announcement about. Ethan recognized it as the leading edge of a wind shear event developing roughly 40 seconds ahead of them. Descend 200, he said to Miles. Now smooth. Miles looked at the instruments. Clear skies. Normal readings. I'm not showing, I know. 200 feet, smooth descent now. Something in Ethan's voice, not loud, not sharp, just certain, made Miles reach for the controls without finishing his objection. They descended smoothly. 18 seconds later, the aircraft immediately above their previous altitude was hit by a sudden shear, a sharp horizontal wind shift that would have rocked the Gulf Stream hard enough to send anything unsecured bouncing off the cabin ceiling. Sloane's coffee, sitting on the conference table, didn't even tremble. Miles stared at his instruments for a moment. Then he looked at Ethan. Ethan was watching the horizon display, with the same expression he'd had since pushback. Not tense, not dramatic, just present. The way a surgeon looks at a procedure they've done 1,000 times, alert, but not anxious. Because alertness and anxiety are entirely different things, and confusing them is how you get into trouble, Miles said quietly. Ethan glanced at him. Felt the nose exactly right. That's how you know something's wrong. When everything feels exactly right, right before it shouldn't. Was quiet for a moment. What program were you in? He asked. Because he was young and smart enough to understand by now that the man sitting in the left seat had not gotten wherever he'd gotten by flying corporate aircraft. Ethan looked at the horizon display. Chicago Center, Whitmore 01, he said into the radio. We're showing some moderate convective activity developing northeast of our position. Request deviation 15 degrees south. The radio came back with the approval. Ethan adjusted the heading. Miles didn't ask again. He understood that the question wasn't going to be answered, and he was professional enough to accept that. Some doors aren't locked. They're just not open. In the cabin, Garrett looked up from his tablet and said quietly, Miss. Sloane looked up. I pulled Ethan Mercer's background. Garrett slid the tablet across the table. Sloane took it. She read for 30 seconds without expression. Then she read for another 30 seconds, and something around her eyes changed, not dramatically, just a slight shift, the way a face moves when a person is recalculating something they thought was already settled. Ethan Mercer, age 32, aircraft maintenance certification, A&P license current, IA rating active, prior employment, United States Air Force. Years of service 8. Program, classified experimental flight test, Edwards Air Force Base, later relocated to a joint facility in Nevada. Commendations 6, including 2 from the Secretary of the Air Force. In specialization, high-speed, high-altitude experimental aircraft. Considered one of the program's most capable test pilots before separation. Separation date 4 years ago. Reason voluntary. Incident referenced prior to separation. 1 fatality, classified ongoing investigation at time of departure. Pilot error findings. No command error findings. Final report still sealed at time of record creation. Sloane put the tablet down. She looked at the cockpit door. She thought about standing in the hangar that morning, pointing at this aircraft and saying, fly this jet in front of a dozen people, like it was a dare, like she was testing something, like he was something to be tested. Garrett was watching her carefully. Don't say anything, she said. I wasn't going to, Garrett said. She looked out the window at the clouds below them. She hadn't been wrong that she needed a pilot. She hadn't been wrong that she needed to get to Washington. She hadn't even been wrong that Ethan Mercer could fly this aircraft. She'd been wrong about what she was doing when she pointed at it and said what she said. Those were different categories of wrong, and Sloane Whitmore was smart enough to understand the difference. They landed at Dulles at 12:23. In the afternoon, 6 minutes, inside the window, Sloane needed to make her meeting. The approach was clean, a standard ILS into runway 19 left, crosswind at 12 knots from the left quarter, a slightly firm surface due to the wind, but the touchdown was smooth enough that the passenger cabin gave no indication of any of that. It simply stopped being airborne and started being on the ground. Miles ran through the after-landing checklist without speaking. Ethan taxied to the assigned ramp area, shut down the engines in sequence, ran the shutdown checklist with the same unhurried discipline he'd maintained for the entire flight, and then removed his headset and set it on the glare shield. He sat in the left seat for a moment. He hadn't planned to feel anything. He'd told himself on the taxiway back in Illinois, when the G550's nose lifted off the runway and the gray sky closed around them, that it was just a flight, an operational necessity, a task, like any other task, that needed doing and that he was capable of doing, and that meant nothing more than that. He sat in the seat. The cockpit smelled like electronics and recycled air, and the faint, chemical smell of aviation fuel that clings to everything in aircraft environments. And Ethan sat there for a moment in the quiet that lands after engines shut down. The systems are cooling and clicking, and the aircraft settles itself and he thought about absolutely nothing at all. Miles was watching him from the right seat. "Good flight," Miles said, carefully, like he was testing the weight of the words before he put them down. Ethan looked at him. "Your radio calls are too formal," Ethan said. "Center doesn't need the aircraft registration on every call after initial contact. It slows down the frequency." Miles blinked. "I was taught what you were taught. I'm telling you what's better." Ethan picked up his headset, hung it on beside the left seat, and stood. "Good scan pattern. You caught the traffic at 11 o'clock before I called it out, which means you were looking where you were supposed to be looking. That's worth more than the radio calls." Miles stared at him. Ethan moved toward the cockpit door. "Thank you," Miles said. He said it without quite knowing why. Ethan paused. "Good first officer," he said. "Keep it up." He went into the cabin. Sloane was standing at the air stair, coat on, briefing binder under her arm. Garrett 2 steps behind her with her bag. She looked up when Ethan came through. They looked at each other. It was a silence that lasted long enough to be a different kind of thing than just a pause. "Your meeting," Ethan said. "Right," she hesitated. Just slightly. On someone else it might not have been visible. On Sloane it registered. "We should talk when I need to get back to Chicago. Dave's got a full maintenance schedule, and I pulled this out of the morning. Tonight then. I'll be flying back this evening. And I'll..." "Works," he said. "I need to be home by 8. She looked at him. He wasn't being difficult. He wasn't posturing. He was telling her that he had a 9-year-old son, and 8 o'clock was 8 o'clock. And those were the terms. 8 o'clock, she repeated. "Or we can talk on the flight back if it's easier." "On the flight back," she said. Ethan nodded once. He stepped aside to let her down the stairs. Sloane Whitmore walked across the Dulles ramp toward the waiting car, and she did not look back, but she thought about the way he'd looked at the Gulfstream in the hangar, not with longing, not with excitement, but with recognition. Way you look at something that belongs to you, even when you've convinced yourself it doesn't. She thought about the laughing. She thought about the word she hadn't said out loud since Garrett, the one she'd been avoiding since Garrett slid the tablet across the table at 33,000 feet. Humiliated. Not him. She got in the car. Ethan went back up the stairs. He sat in the captain's seat again. He didn't have a reason to. The aircraft was parked. The systems were cooling down. He had 6 hours before the return flight, and nothing to do with them except kill time on the Dulles ramp. He sat there anyway. He looked out at the gray February sky over Virginia. He thought about the sound the engines had made when he pushed the throttles forward at rotation. The way the aircraft had nosed up and the wheels had released their grip on the runway, and the whole world had tipped and reorganized itself into something that made a different kind of sense. He thought about how he hadn't thought about Julian once during the entire flight. That had never happened before. Every time he'd been in a cockpit, the handful of times in the past 4 years, when he hadn't been able to avoid simulator recurrency for his certifications, Julian had been there. Literally. Just as a weight. As a shape of absence in the right seat that no one else could see. But for 2 hours and 36 minutes today, with a 30-year-old billionaire in the cabin behind him, and a sharp young first officer beside him, and weather to read and traffic to watch, and a flight to fly, Ethan had just flown. What to do with that? He sat in the seat for a while longer. Then he took the Post-it out of his jacket pocket. "Call me if you need anything, Dad." He looked at it. He folded it carefully and put it back. The return flight was scheduled for 6:15 in the evening, which gave Ethan roughly 5.5 hours on the Dulles ramp, with nothing useful to do. He bought a sandwich from the fixed base operator's pilot lounge turkey, because that was habit at this point, and sat at a table near the window and watched aircraft move on the taxiways. A Citation pulling out to runway 19er, a heavy King Air on short final, a Delta regional jet touching down hard and fast, braking aggressively. Ethan winced slightly at the landing, and then caught himself wincing and looked down at his sandwich. Miles found him there, around 2 o'clock. The young first officer had changed out of his uniform shirt into a plain blue pullover, which made him look about 22 instead of 26, and he was carrying 2 cups of coffee with the slightly uncertain air of someone who wasn't entirely sure how his offer was going to be received. "The lounge coffee is terrible," Miles said. setting one of the cups down in front of Ethan. It's hot. Ethan looked at the cup. Thanks. Miles sat down across from him. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Outside, the Citation was lining up on the runway. 8 years Air Force, Miles said. Not accusing. Really even asking. Just putting it on the table to see what happened. Ethan picked up the coffee cup. Where'd you hear that? Whitmore's assistant was on his phone for most of the approach. I could see his screen. Miles paused. I wasn't trying to look. The tablet was just there. It's fine. Experimental flight test. Miles said it quietly, like he was still processing the weight of it. That's not a small thing. That's not. I mean, I did 4 years of commercial flight training. I've got 1,800 hours, and I feel underprepared for half the situations I encounter. Experimental test pilots are a different category of... He stopped. Sorry, I'm not trying to make it weird. It's not weird, Ethan said. It was a job. I was good at it. I left. Why? The question sat in the air between them, aggressively. Miles was genuinely asking, not because he felt entitled to the answer, but because he was 26 years old, trying to understand how someone gets from where Ethan had been to where Ethan was. Yes, he'd intervened, and he hadn't yet lived enough to know that sometimes the distance between those two places is a single event, and that single events can rewrite everything that comes after them. Wasn't the right time anymore, Ethan said. Miles nodded like that was an answer, even though they both knew it wasn't. Quite. He looked out the window at the runway. The Citation was rolling now, accelerating, the low February sun catching the white paint of the fuselage. You called that wind shear, Miles said. 40 seconds early. 38, how? Ethan was quiet for a moment. He watched the Citation rotate and climb away from the runway. How you can tell sometimes that a room full of people is about to get loud? Before anyone's actually made noise? Something in the air pressure changes. Something in how people are holding themselves. Yeah, weather is like that. You learn to read the preconditions instead of the event. Takes a long time. He took a drink of the coffee. It was, as advertised, terrible. You've got a good scan pattern. Get there. Miles looked at him. You said that before. In the cockpit. I know. You didn't have to. I know that too. Stretch of quiet. A regional turboprop taxied past the window, its propellers catching the light in alternating flashes. I've been flying with Harrison for 14 months, Miles said. He's a good pilot. Good by the book, precise, consistent. He stopped, looking for the word. He never explained anything. I'd ask about a technique or a decision, and he'd say that's procedure or that's experience. Like the answer was a door I hadn't earned the right to open yet. Ethan didn't say anything. You explained the wind shear thing, Miles said. You didn't have to do that either. No, Ethan agreed. I didn't. He finished his coffee. He folded the sandwich wrapper into a neat square the way he always did, without thinking about it, and set it at the corner of the table. The radio calls, he said. The ones I mentioned. Why it matters. Frequency congestion. That's part of it. The other part is that when you over-formalize your radio calls, you use more words than you need. And in a high workload environment, every extra word is a fraction of a second of attention you're pulling away from the aircraft. It adds up. He stood. On a clear day over flat terrain with no traffic, it doesn't matter. The day it matters is the day you don't have the fraction of a second. Looked up at him. Practice economy, Ethan said. In the cockpit. In everything. He picked up his sandwich wrapper and dropped it in the bin by the door, and he walked back toward the crew rest area to try to sleep for a couple hours before the return flight. Miles Barrett sat at the table by the window and watched the afternoon traffic at Dulles and thought about economy and about doors, about what kind of man walks away from experimental test flight and goes to work maintaining other people's aircraft in a hangar outside Chicago. He didn't come up with an answer. But he thought about it for a long time. The return flight departed at 6:22, 7 minutes behind schedule, because a fuel truck had a mechanical issue and needed to be replaced. Ethan used the extra 7 minutes to walk the aircraft again, a full exterior inspection, touching the control surfaces, checking the gear doors, running his hand along the fuselage the way a person runs, a hand along something they're familiar with and checking to confirm. It's still what they remember. Garrett, loading bags into the cargo bay, watched him do this and said nothing. But he watched. Sloane boarded last. At 6:18, her briefing binder tucked under her arm and her Washington meeting presumably concluded. Her expression was neutral in the specific way that neutral expressions are when someone has been managing their face professionally for most of a long day and is no longer entirely sure what their natural expression is supposed to look like. She paused at the air stair. "How was the meeting?" Ethan asked, because he was standing at the bottom of the stairs reviewing the weight and balance paperwork, and it would have been strange not to ask. "Productive," she said. Then, after a small pause, "Long. Washington's always long." She looked at him for a second. "You've been to Washington for work." It wasn't really a question, and Ethan didn't treat it as one. "A few times," he said. "Different circumstances." She went up the stairs. He followed her up, sealed the door, and went into the cockpit. Polteed intervened. They were at 31,000 feet 40 minutes out of Chicago when Sloane knocked on the cockpit door. Miles glanced at Ethan. Ethan said, "Come in." She opened the door and stood in the frame. The cockpit of a G550 at night is a specific kind of beautiful that nobody tells you about. Instrument panels, glowing amber and green and white against the absolute dark outside the windshield. The navigation display painting their course across the center console in quiet colors. Stars above the cloud layer, hard and bright in a way they never are from the ground. Sloane took in the cockpit for a moment. Ethan wasn't sure she'd ever stood in one while it was in this configuration airborne, night, full operation. Most passengers didn't. "You said we could talk on the flight back," she said. "You've got it," Ethan said. Miles straightened slightly. "I've got it." Ethan turned in the seat to face her but didn't get up. The space was too tight for that to make sense, and there was something more direct about staying in the left seat, about speaking with her from there where she'd put him. Yes, he did intervened, rather than standing up to meet her at eye level the way people do when they're performing a quality they haven't quite earned yet. "I owe you an apology," Sloane said. She said it the way people say it, when they've practiced it enough to know what it's supposed to sound like, but the words were just the right ones. Ethan waited. "What I said in the hangar this morning," she said. "The way I said it. She paused. I was condescending. I was treating you like you were something to be tested, rather than someone I was asking for help. You were under pressure," Ethan said. "That's not an excuse, but it's a reason. There's a difference." She looked at him. Something in her expression shifted, not softening exactly, but becoming more careful, yet like she was paying closer attention. "You've been inside the records of this aircraft," she said. "I did the pre-service inspection. Tuesday night, yes. The flight today. The wind shear, the approach." She paused. "Harrison has been flying this aircraft for 3 years. His approaches are good. His pre-flight checks are thorough. He runs a safe operation." Another pause. "But what you did today wasn't in the same category." "Harrison runs a safe operation," Ethan said. "That's not a small thing. Don't undervalue it." "I'm not undervaluing it. I'm making a distinction." "Then make it carefully." She looked at him steadily. "Yeah. I have a flight operations department with 14 pilots and 39 support staff. I have an aviation safety officer who reports to my VP of operations. I've invested significantly in compliance infrastructure." She stopped, and I was genuinely unaware that there are 3 aircraft in my current rotation with unresolved maintenance items that are technically within regulatory tolerances, but that I would not be comfortable flying on if I understood what they actually meant. Ethan was quiet. "Garrett pulled the records," she said. "After I read your background, I had him pull everything: maintenance logs, pilot fatigue reports, training currency records, incident write-ups." She pressed her lips together briefly. "There are things in those records that shouldn't be there, because anyone did anything illegal, because nobody with the right set of eyes was looking at the whole picture. What do your safety officers' reports look like? Clean, technically accurate, but they're written by someone who reports to operations, and operations is evaluated on flight and completion rates and schedule reliability." She said it without apparent emotion, but Ethan could hear the thing under it, the particular discomfort of someone who is smart enough to see the architecture of a mistake they built themselves. "I created a structure where safety reporting was accurate within the boundaries of what operations wanted to be true." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. "You know what that is," he said. Question. "An organization that's better at looking safe than being safe." She said it plainly. "Yes. I've been thinking about that for about 6 hours. Miles shifted almost imperceptibly in the right seat, the small adjustment of someone who is not listening, but is inevitably hearing something. "What do you want from me?" Ethan asked. "I want to know what you saw," she said. "The maintenance records. In the flight today. I want to know what someone with your background and your—" She seemed to weigh the word choice. "Your particular way of seeing things would do with my aviation operation." "I'm a mechanic at Meridian Air Services," Ethan said. "You were a test pilot at Edwards." "I was." He held her gaze. "And then I wasn't. Why?" The question landed in the cockpit the same way Miles's version of it had landed in the pilot lounge that afternoon. But from Sloane's mouth it had a different shape, sharper, more direct. The question of someone who had just read a file that ended with the word classified, and a single line about a fatality, and no further detail. Ethan looked at the navigation display. Their course line was a clean arc across the darkened map, the waypoints marked in sequence ahead of them, Chicago's cluster of Nevades waiting at the end of it. "Someone died," he said. "Someone I was responsible for." The cockpit was quiet, except for the ambient sound of the engines and the whisper of air over the fuselage at 520 knots. "The file says no pilot error," Sloane said carefully. "The file says a lot of things." "What do you say?" He didn't answer for long enough that it stopped being a pause and became something else. Miles was looking fixedly at his instruments, doing a very professional job of not being in the room. "I say he's gone," Ethan said finally, "and the rest of it," he stopped. He was quiet for another few seconds. "The rest of it I'm still working out." Sloane didn't push it. That surprised him a little. She didn't seem like someone who left threads unpulled, but she let that one go, and he was grateful for it, even though he didn't show it. "The 3 aircraft with unresolved items," he said. "Which ones?" She gave him the tail numbers. He knew all 3. He'd seen those records when Meridian had serviced 2 of them in the past year, and the 3rd he'd reviewed in a different context. Entirely it had come through for an unscheduled inspection 8 months ago, months after a pressurization anomaly that a previous mechanic had documented, and a subsequent review had marked resolved. "The pressurization item on the 3rd aircraft," he said, "was the resolution finding. Normal variation within spec, yes. I saw that write-up." He kept his voice level. "That aircraft had an identical anomaly, flagged 18 months before the one in the current records. The mechanic who logged the first one is no longer with that service facility. The second mechanic who reviewed it either didn't know about the first instance or didn't look for it. The write-up on the resolution doesn't reference the earlier incident." Sloane stared at him. "How do you know about the first incident?" "Because I talked to the mechanic who logged it. He came through Meridian about 14 months ago, looking for work. We talked shop." He mentioned it. Ethan looked at her. "He said he was told the aircraft was fine and to let it go. He didn't feel good about that. That's part of why he left." The silence that followed had a different texture than the previous silences. Heavier, more specific. "I need to ground that aircraft," Sloane said. "Tonight." "Tonight," he agreed. "And you need to find that mechanic and get his original documentation, because I'll bet you he kept a copy." "You think it's serious?" "I think 2 instances of the same pressurization anomaly, with no documented causal link between them, is a pattern that needs explaining before that aircraft carries anyone to altitude." He said it evenly, without drama, the same way he would have said it in a maintenance brief. "It might be nothing. It might be a sensor issue. It might be something else. Until you know which one it is, you know the aircraft should be on the ground." Sloane took out her phone. She called someone Garrett, by the sound of the first exchange, and the conversation was short and specific. "Which aircraft, which hangar, ground it now, tonight. I don't care what's scheduled. And don't tell the ops team why, until I'm back." She hung up. She stood in the cockpit door for a moment, looking out at the dark windshield. "The other 2 aircraft," she said. "Can they fly?" "With conditions. There are items that need to be resolved within a specific number of flight hours. Not immediately. I'd want to look at the complete records before I gave you a final read, but nothing in what I've seen suggests immediate grounding." He paused. "That can change when someone looks more carefully." "Will you look more carefully? In what capacity?" She looked at him. "That's what I want to talk about." "I'm listening. I want you to run my flight operations." She said it directly, with no preliminary softening. Director of Flight Operations. You would oversee all maintenance scheduling, safety compliance, pilot training currency, and incident reporting. Direct access to me. Your findings would not route through operations or any other intermediary. Ethan was quiet. You would be compensated significantly better than your current position, she added. I figured, he said. He wasn't being sarcastic. He just wasn't particularly interested in that part of it. What would my authority be if I found something that an operations executive wanted to push through? Explain what you mean. If I grounded an aircraft and someone above me in a parallel chain decided the flight schedule was more important. There's no one above you in the safety chain. Your decisions on airworthiness are final. And if you disagree with one of my decisions, she hesitated, just slightly. I would expect you to explain your reasoning. I'm asking what happens if I explain my reasoning and you still disagree. Hesitation was longer, this time. And Ethan respected the fact that she actually thought about it, rather than just giving him the answer she thought he needed to hear. The aircraft stays grounded, she said finally. I hire you for your judgment. If I override your judgment because it's inconvenient for the business, then I'm just repeating the same mistake in a different form. No. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. And mechanics, he said. The people doing the physical work on these aircraft. What's their current compensation structure? Something crossed her face. That's an operational question I'd need to Sloane. He said her name without title, without softening. First time. She went still slightly. If you have a safety culture problem, it didn't start in the cockpit. It started in the hangars. It started with mechanics who are underpaid and overworked, and who've learned that raising concerns creates more problems for them than it solves. You cannot build a safe flight operation on top of a maintenance workforce that doesn't believe anyone is listening to them. That's not how this works. She looked at him. I know the compensation data for your ground crews, he said. Garrett pulled your records. He pulled all of them. Your lead mechanics are making $43,000 a year in the Chicago metro area. You cannot hire someone who actually knows what they're doing for $43,000 a year, which means you're getting the people who can't get hired somewhere better, or you're getting good people who are looking for something better while they work for you. Either way, you are not getting the level of attention and expertise that your aircraft need. She stopped. That's a significant operational restructuring. The cost implications alone are considerably less than the cost of a pressurization failure at 38,000 feet, he said. With government officials in the cabin, the words landed and stayed there. Sloane pressed her lips together. She looked at the navigation display, which showed them 42 minutes from Chicago, their course line steady and unhurried across the dark. You're not negotiating, she said. No, most people coming into a conversation like this would negotiate. I'm not interested in a position where I perform safety and people perform listening, he said. I've seen what that looks like from the maintenance side. And it's not what you need, and it's not what I'm willing to do. If the real answer is that you want someone who will identify problems and then work around the business constraints to make the problems go away on paper, I'm the wrong person. I'm genuinely the wrong person for that. And if the real answer is that I want the problems actually fixed, we might be able to work something out. She looked at him for a long, still moment. I need to think, she said. Take your time. I'll have an answer before we land. That's faster than you need to decide. I know. Something in her expression not softening, exactly, but becoming more honest. I don't usually need a long time to decide things. I need a long time to decide things correctly. She paused. Those are different. Yes, he said. They are. She went back into the cabin. Miles let out a very controlled breath. Sorry, he said. I know, Ethan said. He checked the weather display. Light winds over Indiana. Skies clearing ahead of them toward the Chicago metro. The cold front had pushed through while they were in Washington. It would be a clean approach. How's your instrument scan? Fine, Miles said, slightly thrown by the pivot. Run through it. Miles looked at him. We've got 40 minutes, Ethan said. Use them. And Miles Barrett, who had spent 14 months with the captain who answered every question with that procedure, ran through his instrument scan out loud for the first time since his check ride, and Ethan listened and corrected twice and said nothing the other times, because those times there was nothing to correct. Sloane came back to the cockpit with 11 minutes remaining before they entered the Chicago approach sequence. Yes, she said. Ethan didn't look up from the instruments. To what specifically? To all of it. She said it like she was aware of what she was committing to, and had decided to commit to it anyway. Safety decisions are yours. Mechanic compensation gets reviewed and restructured before the end of the first quarter. Pilots can report concerns to you directly, without routing through operations. She paused. And you report to me, not to the VP of operations or anyone else in the business chain. Direct line. I want a formal safety reporting system, he said. Anonymous, so ground crews and pilots can flag concerns without putting their names on something that could affect their employment. I want 30 days to assess the full maintenance records and pilot training currency before I agree to clear any aircraft that's currently in rotation. 30 days. And I need to stay at Meridian through the end of the month to properly transition my current responsibilities to another mechanic. I won't leave Dave short-handed because of a situation I created. She was quiet for a moment. That's 3 weeks. Yes. I can start the restructuring without you in seat for 3 weeks. That would be helpful. Another pause. You're asking me to restructure my entire operations culture in 30 days. I'm asking you to commit to it in 30 days, he said. Actually doing it will take longer. If you're expecting a different aviation culture in 30 days, you'll be disappointed. How long? Depends how deep the problems go. He pulled up the Chicago approach briefing on the navigation display. 6 months before, the mechanics stop waiting for the other shoe to drop. A year before the pilots trust the reporting system, enough to actually use it. 2 years before any of it is second nature. He glanced at her. You're asking me to help you build something that won't feel like it's working for a long time. Most people in your position don't have the patience for that. I'm not most people in my position. No, he said. He reached for the radio. Chicago approach, Whitmore 01, descending through flight level 240, information kilo. The reply came back clear and immediate. He began the descent, and the city lights of Chicago appeared in the lower left quadrant of the windshield, orange and white, against the dark flatness of Illinois, enormous and spreading and ordinary, in the way that only familiar things are ordinary. Sloane stood in the cockpit doorway for the approach, which was technically against regulations, and Ethan didn't say anything about that, because the approach was clean and uncomplicated, and because there was something in the way she stood watching the city come up through the windshield that suggested she needed to see it. The whole of it. The aircraft descending, the city rising, the lights of the runway appearing at 12 miles out, like an answer to a question nobody had asked out loud. He put the Gulfstream down at 9:47 in the evening, because the wind had shifted in the last few miles, and there was a slight tail component that changed the energy numbers. And Ethan made the adjustment and got most of it, but not all of it. Touchdown had a bit more authority than he'd wanted. He felt it in the seat. Miles wrote something in the corner of the approach plate. What did you write? Ethan asked, taxiing clear of the runway. Miles held it up. He'd written the word wind with an arrow and a correction value. Ethan said, keep doing that. He was in his truck at 10:15, heading toward Elk Grove Village, with the heat on high because the February night had gone down to about 12 degrees, and his phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. No, ate 2 bowls of cereal for dinner, and informed me that this was nutritionally adequate. He's asleep, key under the mat. Ethan read it at a red light, and something in his chest did a complicated thing that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite something else. He texted back, thank you, Linda, I owe you. Her reply came, you owe me nothing. Drive safe. He drove through the frozen Illinois dark, and he thought about the Gulf Stream at 33,000 feet and the instrument panel glowing in the dark, the way the navigation lights of other aircraft showed up against the stars like slow-moving punctuation. He thought about Miles and his instrument scan and his careful radio calls. He thought about Sloane standing in the cockpit door, watching the city come up through the windshield with an expression he still hadn't fully decoded. He thought briefly about the way his voice had sounded on the radio. Settled, like something that had been sitting in the wrong position had finally shifted back to where it was supposed to be. He pulled into the apartment complex at 10:51, parked the truck, and sat for a moment in the cold cab, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. Through the window of the apartment, he could see the light he always left on above the kitchen table, the one that was visible from the parking lot, the one that meant everything was where it was supposed to be. He got out of the truck. He went upstairs quietly, no atonto the way he always did, door cracked 2 inches, just enough to hear the breathing, and then stood in his own kitchen with his jacket still on, and looked at the refrigerator where the post-it note said, "Afternoon care until 6. Mrs. Daly has the key. Call me if you need anything." Dad. He'd written that at 5 this morning. 12 hours ago, he was a mechanic at Meridian Air Services, and that was all he was. And that was a manageable thing to be, with clear boundaries and known hours, and a 9-year-old who cut his sandwiches diagonally. He peeled the note off the refrigerator. He held it for a moment. He thought about what it would really mean, past the job title and the salary, and the restructured safety culture to fly again. Occasionally, not under duress, regularly, in the left seat with the weight of it, with real responsibility for real aircraft and real people in the cabin. He thought about Julian. He thought about the cockpit today, and the 2 hours and 36 minutes when Julian hadn't been there, and about how that absence of absence had felt like something he couldn't name yet, something that lived in the same neighborhood as relief, but wasn't quite that either. He set the post-it note down on the counter. He didn't throw it away. He just put it down. He went to bed. He lay in the dark and listened to Noah breathe through the wall, and the breathing was steady, and there, the way it always was, and outside the window he could hear faintly, on the wind that had shifted with the cold front, the sound of aircraft on the approach path to O'Hare, descending through the dark toward the runway lights, their engines a low and constant frequency that he had always told himself was just background noise. He'd been telling himself that for 4 years. He didn't sleep well. Wasn't unusual. What was unusual was what kept him awake. For 4 years, the thing that lived in the ceiling above his bed at night had been Julian's, specifically Julian's voice on the intercom during those last 14 seconds, calm in the way that people get calm when the situation has moved past the point where being calm actually helps, when calm is just the last available form of control. I'm losing hydraulics on the left side. I'm losing it. And then static. And then nothing. That was the thing in the ceiling. That specific sequence. Those specific words. Ethan had replayed them so many times they'd worn grooves in whatever part of the brain stores things you cannot put down. But tonight the ceiling was different. Tonight what kept him awake was not a memory. It was a question. What if the story he'd been living inside for 4 years wasn't the right story? He knew what the file said. Sloane had told him, and he'd already known, because he'd been briefed at the time, a brief delivered by a JAG officer in a gray room at the base in Nevada who spoke carefully and looked at his hands more than at Ethan, which is what people do when they're delivering information they expect to land badly. The investigation found no pilot error, no command error. The board's determination is that the actuator failure was a manufacturing defect, pre-existing, undetectable under standard inspection protocols. And Ethan had sat in that gray room and nodded and said nothing, and gone back to his quarters and started the process of leaving. No! He'd told himself he was leaving because of Julian, because he had a son who needed a father who came home, and because he'd understood, finally, what it cost the people around you when you did a job that could kill you. He'd told himself that for 4 years. But tonight, lying in the dark with the distant sound of aircraft descending toward O'Hare, he thought about the way he'd felt in the left seat of the Gulfstream, not excited, not desperate, just settled, and he thought about the JG officer looking at his hands, and he thought about the file that said no pilot error, and he thought about the fact that he had never actually read the complete investigation report. Received the summary. He'd been briefed on the findings. He'd signed an acknowledgement form, but he'd never read the actual report. He'd told himself he didn't need to. He told himself the summary was enough. He told himself a lot of things for 4 years that he was now, lying in the dark at 11:40 on a Tuesday night in February, beginning to suspect were not entirely accurate. Found him at the kitchen table at 6 in the morning, still in yesterday's clothes, yellow legal pad in front of him with the name Colonel Arden Beck, written at the top and a phone number below it and nothing else on the page. Was 9 years old and sharp in the specific way that children of single parents sometimes are attuned to the emotional weather of the one adult they rely on. More observant than adults give them credit for. More careful with their observations than they let on. He looked at his father. He looked at the legal pad. He opened the refrigerator and got out the orange juice and poured 2 glasses without being asked and set one in front of Ethan and sat down across from him. "You didn't sleep," Noah said. "I slept a little." Looked at him with the expression of someone who knows when they're being managed and has decided not to make an issue of it. He drank his orange juice. "Mrs. Daly said you flew an airplane yesterday," he said. Ethan looked up. "She told you that?" "She said a lady made you fly her jet and you did it in your work clothes." Noah considered this. "That's pretty cool. It was a work situation. A cool work situation." Turned his glass in slow circles on the table, the way he did when he was thinking about something he wasn't sure he had permission to ask. Ethan recognized the motion. He'd been watching it since Noah was about 6. "You can fly airplanes," Noah said. It came out as a statement rather than a question, which meant he'd known it for a while, and was only now deciding to say it out loud. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Where'd you hear that?" "I didn't hear it anywhere. I just—" Noah shrugged, a 9-year-old shrug, one shoulder higher than the other. "Stuff about planes. You know stuff I don't think mechanics are supposed to know. What pilots know." He looked at his father. "I've always kind of figured." Ethan looked at his son. Had his mother's eyes that was something Ethan still noticed, even now, 4 years after she left. Not left them. Left him, specifically, with a clarity and a lack of drama that had actually made it harder in some ways. Because there was nothing to be angry at, no betrayal to organize your grief around. She just decided she wanted a different life. She'd been honest about it. She'd stayed involved in Noah's life in the way that logistics allowed, which was less than either of them would have chosen, but more than some. It was what it was. Noah had her eyes and her way of sitting with a question before he asked it, and right now he was sitting with something bigger than his usual questions. "Did you used to fly?" he asked. "Yes," Ethan said. "A long time ago." "Why'd you stop?" Ethan looked at the legal pad, at the name and number written there. "It's complicated. Because of your friend who died." Ethan went very still, was watching him with those eyes. "I heard you talk about it once. On the phone, a couple years ago. I wasn't trying to listen, He stopped. "You were talking to somebody and you said your friend died and it was your fault. And I didn't say anything because you sounded really sad." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a car started in the parking lot. A door closed somewhere in the building. A dog barked twice and then stopped. "Was it your fault?" Ethan looked at his son for a long time. He said, and it was the most honest thing he'd said about Julian in 4 years. And saying it, he'd intervened, and saying it out loud in the kitchen with his 9-year-old across from him felt like putting something down that had been changing the shape of his hands. For so long he'd forgotten. His hands had a different shape once. Nodded. Like that answer was acceptable. Like the honesty of it was more important than whatever the actual answer was. "Are you going to find out?" Noah asked. Ethan looked at the legal pad. He said, "I think so." Noah drank the rest of his orange juice. He put the glass down. "Can I have cereal?" "Yeah," Ethan said. "What kind?" "The kind with the little moons." "We're out of that kind." "The other kind, then." Ethan got up and got the cereal and poured it, and put the bowl in front of his son and stood at the counter for a moment with his hands flat on the cold tile, looking at nothing in particular. He picked up the legal pad and went to get his phone. Colonel Arden Beck had retired from the Air Force 14 months earlier after 31 years of service, most of it in flight test and evaluation programs at various facilities, including the Nevada facilities where Ethan's had served. He lived now in Flagstaff, Arizona. According to the contact information, Ethan had carried in phone's notes app for 4 years without ever using it. Beck had given him the number the day Ethan cleared out his quarters. He'd stood in the doorway and watched Ethan pack and said very little, which was Beck's way. He was a man who understood that some moments required presence rather than words. And on his way outdoor, he'd pressed a card into Ethan's hand and said, "When you're ready to stop running from the wrong thing, call me." Ethan had almost thrown the card away 3 times. He'd intervened. He called at 7:20 in the morning, sitting in his truck in the parking lot, because the apartment walls were thin and he didn't want Noah to hear. Beck picked up on the third ring. His voice was the same as it had been 4 years ago, unhurried, with a slight Texas flatness to it, that age hadn't changed. Mercer, Beck said, not a greeting. Just recognition. It's Arden. I've been retired long enough that Colonel gives me a headache. A pause. I wondered when you'd call. 4 years is a long time to wonder. Really. Not for something like this. There was a sound in the background, a chair. Maybe. Beck, settling into it. How's the boy? He's good. He's 9 now. He eats cereal for dinner when he thinks he can get away with it. Smart kid. A pause. What do you need, Ethan? And here was the thing about Beck, he never made you walk around the outside of the question. He just opened the door and waited. The Julian Cross accident report, Ethan said. The complete investigation report, not the summary brief. I never read it. The silence on the other end was about 3 seconds long, which for Beck was the equivalent of a long considered pause. Beck said, Is it something you can get me access to? Most of it was declassified 18 months ago. Routine process, they declassify the safety investigation portions after a certain period unless there's ongoing operational sensitivity. Another pause. The technical findings, the sequence of events, the board's conclusions. All available. Why didn't anyone tell me? Beck was quiet for a moment. 'Cause you left. You were out of the system. Declassification notices go to active personnel and formal next of kin. You were neither. He paused. And I think, if I'm honest, most people figured you'd read it when you were ready. If you were ready. Ethan looked through the windshield at the apartment building. Second floor, second window from the left, Noah's bedroom light was on now, visible through the curtains. He'd be getting dressed for school. Can you send it to me? I can send you the declassified portion today. There are about 40 pages that are still classified, mostly related to the aircraft's propulsion specifications and some of the test program parameters. But the accident sequence, the mechanical findings, the board's determination, all of that is clear. Okay, Ethan. Beck's voice changed slightly, not softer exactly. More direct. You need to be ready for what's in it. What's in it? What's in it? Read it yourself. I've spent 4 years not telling you things you needed to hear from the page, not from me. He stopped. Just be somewhere you can sit with it for a while when you read it. Open it between appointments. Okay, Ethan said again. And Mercer, another pause. You still flying? Ethan looked at his hands on the steering wheel. Yesterday, for the first time in 4 years. How was it? He thought about the G550 lifting off the Meridian runway in the gray February morning. The weight of the aircraft in the controls, the wind shear he'd felt, before the instruments caught it. The approach into Dulles, with the crosswind and the slight tail component, and the touchdown that was firmer than he wanted. Like finding out a room in your house was there the whole time, he said. And you'd just had the door closed. Beck was quiet for a moment. He said, finally, That's a good thing, Ethan. Don't know yet. I do. Beck said it without sentiment, just as fact, the way a man who has watched pilots for 30 years says things about pilots. The report will be in your email by noon. Read it. Call me after. He hung up. Ethan sat in the truck for another minute. Then he went back inside to make sure Noah had his backpack and his lunch turkey sandwich cut diagonally and to drive him to school. He spent the morning at Meridian because he had a job to finish and because he was, at his core, a person who finished what he started. Dave Kowalski met him at the door with the expression of a man who has approximately 17 questions and has decided, out of some combination of respect and self-preservation, to ask none of them. Good trip? Kowalski said. Straightforward, Ethan said. I need to talk to you today. About some things. Kowalski looked at him. Whitmore thing, among others. After lunch? My office. Bring your own coffee, mine's terrible today. Ethan changed into his coveralls and went back to the Challenger 350, which he'd left the previous morning with the APU, no U-fault documented, and the aircraft grounded. He spent the morning completing the repair documentation, coordinating with the parts supplier for the replacement seal, and writing up the full inspection summary in the careful, thorough way he always did not, because anyone required that level of detail, but because detailed records were the difference between a future mechanic understanding what happened and a future mechanic making assumptions. He thought about the mechanic Sloane had mentioned. The one who'd flagged the pressurization anomaly and been told it was fine, and had eventually left. He thought about that man sitting at his workbench with a problem he could see, and nobody above him willing to look at it and writing up his documentation carefully. Because that's what you do, even when you suspect nobody will read it. He thought about a lot of things while he worked. Working with his hands had always been that way. His hands knew what to do, which freed his mind to go wherever it needed to go, which was sometimes useful and sometimes not. At 11:47, his phone buzzed with an email notification. The subject line was the date and an incident reference number, and no other text. The sender was a .gov address he didn't recognize, which meant Beck had routed it through official channels rather than sending it himself, which was the right call cleaner, documented, above board. He looked at the email notification for a moment. Then he put his phone back in his pocket and finished the repair summary he was writing. Because Beck had said don't open it between appointments, and finishing the summary was an appointment, even if it was just with himself. He completed it at 12:10. He sent it to Kowalski for review. He washed his hands. He went to his truck. He read it in the parking lot. No, with the heat running and the windows fogging slightly at the edges, and he read it the same way he read maintenance logs completely, in sequence, without skipping ahead, because skipping ahead meant you carried assumptions into the later sections instead of letting the earlier sections build the picture for you. The report was 63 pages. Beck had been right that the first 40 were declassified, and those 40 pages were the ones that mattered. It started, as all accident investigation reports start, with the facts. Time, location, aircraft designation, crew identification. Julian Cross listed as pilot, Ethan Mercer listed as mission commander. Weather at time of incident. Flight profile at time of incident. The sequence of events. Ethan read through the sequence, and it was familiar in the way that nightmares are familiar. You know what's coming, and you experience it again anyway, each detail clicking into place like something inevitable. The climb profile. The test maneuver at altitude. The first indication of an anomaly, which was not a warning light, but a subtle asymmetry in the control response that Julian had reported, and Ethan had immediately acted on, directing Julian to reduce power on the affected side and begin a controlled descent. What the report said next was not what Ethan's memory said. His memory, the version he'd been carrying for 4 years, said he had hesitated. That there was a moment, 3 or 4 seconds, between Julian's report of the asymmetry and his own response, and that those 3 or 4 seconds had been the difference between a controlled emergency and an uncontrolled one. That he had heard Julian's voice and processed it and done the math too slowly, and that the math comes slowly was why Julian was dead. The report's event timeline, reconstructed from the aircraft's data recorder and cockpit voice recording, showed a response time of less than 1 second. Julian reported the anomaly at 14:23 hours, 31 seconds. Ethan's response command came at 14:23 hours, 32 seconds. Less than 1 second. He read that line 3 times. Less than 1 second. His memory had taken 1 second and turned it into 4 years. He kept reading. The mechanical findings section was the longest part of the report. 41 paragraphs describing the actuator failure in technical language that Ethan, who had spent 8 years working with experimental aircraft and 4 years as a professional mechanic, could follow precisely. The actuator in question was part of the experimental flight control system, specific to that aircraft variant. The failure was caused by a microscopic fracture in the actuator, housing a fracture that had been present since manufacture, introduced during the casting process, invisible under all standard inspection protocols, and detectable only through a specialized ultrasonic testing method that had not yet been developed at the time of manufacture, present at the time of the previous maintenance check, caused by the flight, not caused by the test maneuver, caused by anything Ethan had directed Julian to do, present since the day the part came out of the factory, a defect waiting in the part like a sentence that had already been written, waiting for the moment that it would be read aloud. The report continued. The board's findings on crew performance noted that Ethan's response to the initial anomaly report had been immediate and appropriate, that his instructions to Julian had been correct given the information available, that the subsequent loss of the aircraft was the result of of the actuator failure progressing faster than any response could have addressed, and that the failure timeline was inconsistent with survivability under any response scenario. And then a sentence that Ethan had to read twice, not because it was unclear, but because his brain kept sliding off it. The way you slide off information that contradicts something you've believed long enough that the belief has become structural. Mission Commander Mercer's actions during the emergency phase of the incident were assessed by the board as exceptional. The board notes that Commander Mercer's immediate and accurate response to the developing emergency, while unable to prevent the loss of the aircraft due to the pre-existing mechanical defect, represents performance consistent with the highest standards of the program. The board further notes that Commander Mercer's management of his own aircraft during the subsequent emergency conditions, which presented a significant probability of a second loss, was a primary factor in his own survival. Ethan sat with that. Outside the truck window, the Meridian flight line was doing its usual midday business. A fuel truck crawling along the ramp, a Learjet being towed into position, two mechanics doing a post-inspection on a Phenom 300, their breath visible in the cold air, moving around the aircraft in the unhurried pattern of people who know what they're doing. He tried to count how many times he'd said to himself, "In the dark, in the ceiling above his bed, I was too slow." He couldn't count it. The number was too large. He'd built an entire architecture of guilt on a memory that was wrong by 3 seconds. Less than 1 second, the report said, and his brain had made it 4 years. He closed the email. He sat in the truck for a long time. He didn't cry. He wanted to, and he recognized that wanting. But what came instead was something older and quieter than crying, a physical sensation somewhere in his chest, like pressure, releasing, like a room depressurizing, like something that had been locked at a stress point for a very long time, finally giving way, not with a crack, but with the slow settling of something finding its right position. Julian was gone. Julian had been gone for 4 years, and that was real, and no report changed it, and no finding by any board changed the fact that Ethan had been in command and Julian had not come home. But the story he'd told himself, the specific, precise, detailed story about the moment he'd failed for seconds that had cost his friend his life, that story was not true. And he'd been living inside it for 4 years. He called Beck. Beck answered on the first ring, which meant he'd been waiting. "I read it," Ethan said. "Yeah," Beck said, "the response time. I had 4 seconds in my head. 4 years of 4 seconds. Ethan, how do you—" He stopped. Tried again. "How does a person's brain do that? Take 1 second and make it 4 years? Beck was quiet for a moment. "Because 1 second doesn't explain why your friend died, and you didn't. Brains need an explanation. They'll invent one if they have to." He paused. "They invented one for you that put the weight of it on your shoulders. Because that was easier than the alternative." "What's the alternative?" "That sometimes people die in ways that don't require someone to be responsible for it. That sometimes a part fails. That sometimes a part fails and someone's in the wrong seat at the wrong moment and there's no lesson and no mistake and no thing you could have done differently." Beck's voice was steady, the steadiness of someone who has thought about this for a long time. "That's genuinely hard to live with. Guilt is easier. Guilt means there was something you could have controlled. Guilt means if you'd been better, it wouldn't have happened. Guilt gives you the illusion that the world makes that kind of sense." Ethan pressed the back of his head against the headrest and looked at the truck's ceiling. "He's still gone," Ethan said. "Yes. Reading the report doesn't change that. It doesn't." Beck's voice was careful and real, and not trying to fix anything. "What it changes is what you do with it. Whether you spend the rest of your life paying a debt you don't owe. Whether your kid grows up with a father who's there but not who gave himself up as a sacrifice to something that never required one." A pause. "You can grieve Julian, Ethan. You're allowed to just grieve him. Without the rest of it." Ethan closed his eyes. He thought about Julian, not the intercom voice in the last 14 seconds, but the other Julian. The one who talked too much during pre-mission briefs, and never in a way that was actually annoying. The one who could eat a truly offensive amount of food at any given meal and never gained a pound, which Ethan had found irritating in a friendly way. The one who'd been 29 years old and good at the thing they did together, and alive in the specific bright way of people who don't know they're not going to be alive for much longer. Ethan had not thought about that Julian in 4 years. He'd only thought about the last 14 seconds. Okay, he said. Just that. Okay. Beck let the words sit there without adding to it. I took a job, Ethan said after a moment. Flying again. Flight operations, but flying too. Tell me. He told Beck about Sloane, the hangar, the Gulfstream, the Washington flight, and the return, and the conversations he had 31,000 feet, and the terms he'd laid out and the terms she'd accepted. He told it plainly, without drama, the way he reported maintenance findings, complete, accurate, without editorializing. When he finished, Beck was quiet for a few seconds. How was it? Beck asked. Flying again, actually. Strange, Ethan said. Like I kept waiting to feel something I didn't feel. I kept waiting to feel like I was doing something wrong by being in the seat. And I just flew the airplane. He paused. It was just flying. It was always just flying, Beck said. Everything else was what you put on top of it. Ethan looked out the truck window at the two mechanics walking their inspection pattern around the Phenom. Breath in the cold air. The routine, ordinary business of people who know what they're doing. He'd have told me to stop being an idiot, Ethan said. Beck made a sound that was almost a laugh. Julian Cross would have told you to stop being an idiot after about 6 months. He would have said it loudly and at dinner so everybody heard. Yeah, Ethan said. He would have. They stayed on the phone for another minute without saying much. Just two people who'd known Julian Cross and had been carrying different shapes of his absence for 4 years, sitting with it for a moment before putting it back down into the form it was going to take. From now on, not a weight, just a permanent truth, the kind that doesn't stop being true, but eventually stops being the only true thing. Kowalski's office was small and perpetually buried in paper, and smelled like bad coffee and motor oil, and it was, Ethan had always thought, one of the more honest rooms he'd ever spent time in. Pretension, no decor, just the actual physical residue of work. Kowalski listened without interrupting, which was a professional courtesy Ethan appreciated. He laid it out Whitmore's offer, the terms, the 3-week transition timeline he'd requested, and his intention to formally give notice by end of week. When he finished, Kowalski looked at him for a long moment. 3 weeks, Kowalski said. I won't leave you short. We can bring up Martinez, he's ready for more responsibility. And the Challenger inspection protocols I've been developing, I'll document everything before I go. Complete handover. Kowalski nodded slowly. He picked up his coffee cup, looked at it, put it down without drinking from it. What I'm going to say, that it's about time. Kowalski pointed at him. It's about time, Dave. Ethan, you are the best mechanic I've ever had. I say that with full awareness of how much it's going to hurt to lose you. But you have been, he looked for the word. You've been doing mechanic work with a pilot's head for 4 years. And I think we both knew it was temporary. And I think we both didn't say anything about it, because you needed it to be what it was for a while. He shook his head. You caught 3 things this year alone that our inspection protocols would have missed. 3 things. You know what that number represents to me? 3 aircraft that didn't have problems at altitude. 3 aircraft with people in them. Kowalski looked at him directly. That's what you do. That's what you actually do. So go do it somewhere that can use all of it. Ethan was quiet for a moment. The Whitmore operation has real problems, he said. It's not a clean situation I'm walking into. Have you ever wanted a clean situation? A fair point, and Ethan didn't argue it. I'll have the transition documentation done by end of next week, he said. Take your time. Do it right. Kowalski stood and extended his hand. For what it's worth, I think you've been ready for this for a while. I think you've been waiting for a reason. Ethan shook his hand. She pointed at the jet, Ethan said. Kowalski laughed a real laugh, surprised out of him. She pointed at the jet, he repeated. And you said okay. In your coveralls. I forgot to change. Kowalski was still laughing when Ethan left the office. He picked Noah up from school at 3:15 ST because it was his day, and he was for the first time in 4 years not working late into the evening. Got in the truck with his backpack over one shoulder and his jacket half on, the way 9-year-olds get into vehicles, and buckled his seatbelt and looked at his father. Okay? Noah asked. Yeah, Ethan said. Better, actually. Considered this. Did you call about your friend? And. Ethan pulled out of the school parking lot and headed toward home. The afternoon was clear and cold. The February sky gone from gray to a pale, clean blue, the kind of blue that shows up sometimes after a front passes and makes Illinois look like somewhere else. It wasn't my fault, Ethan said. He said it simply without theater, because Noah was 9 and 9-year-olds don't need theater, they need straight answers. Thought it was for a long time. It wasn't. Noah was quiet for a moment. That's good, he said. Yeah. Are you sad? Ethan thought about it honestly. I'm sad my friend is gone. I've been sad about that for 4 years. I just had it mixed up with something else. He glanced at Noah. I'm not sad the same way I was this morning. Noah nodded. He looked out the window at the pale blue sky. Are you going to fly again? He asked. For the new job? Yes, Noah turned to look at him. Is that okay that you want to? Ethan looked at his son. He said, I think it is. Noah turned back to the window. He put his hand up on the glass for a moment, palm flat against the cold, and looked at the sky the way kids look at things fully, without the protective layer of self-consciousness that adults develop, just seeing it for what it is. He said, so it was, Ethan thought, exactly the right word. The last 3 weeks at Meridian were the most productive of Ethan's 4 years there, which was saying something. He documented everything. Not quickly, not as a formality, with the kind of thoroughness that comes from someone who understands that the documents they leave behind are conversations with people they'll never meet, future mechanics, working on aircraft Ethan would never see again, reading his notes, trusting his observations, making decisions on what based on he chose to put on the page and what he chose to leave out. He wrote inspection protocols for the Challenger series that were 20 pages longer than the ones they'd been using, because the existing ones were wrong, but because they were incomplete in the ways that incomplete things are always incomplete fine until they weren't. He spent 2 afternoons with a young mechanic named Carlos Martinez, walking him through the APU fault he'd diagnosed and repaired, going slower than the repair required, so that Martinez understood not just what the problem was, but how to recognize the conditions that led to it. Martinez was 24 and careful and genuinely curious, which were the 3 things that mattered most in a mechanic. Yes, he'd intervened, and Ethan found himself explaining things he'd never articulated out loud before, intuitions about aircraft that he'd always carried as feeling rather than language, discovering as he explained them that they had language after all, that they'd just never needed it until now. How do you know when something's wrong before the instruments tell you? Martinez asked the second afternoon, sitting on a toolbox while Ethan walked him through the APU documentation. At first, Ethan said, at first you just know the instruments. Then you know the instruments well enough that when they're slightly off. Then eventually you know the normal baseline so completely that you can feel the deviation before it registers. He paused, looking for a better way to say it. You know how you can tell when someone's lying? Not because of any one thing they do, but because of 100 tiny things that don't add up to the picture they're trying to make? Aircraft are like that. They're always telling you something. You have to learn the baseline before you can hear what they're saying. Martinez thought about that. How long does it take? Longer than you want it to. Shorter than you think. Ethan closed the documentation binder and handed it to him. Read everything I wrote, not to memorize it, just to understand the way I think about it. Develop your own way. Martinez took the binder and held it with both hands like it was heavier than it looked. You're really leaving, he said. Not accusatory, just stating a fact that he was still adjusting to. End of the week, Ethan said. Is it better? Where you're going? Ethan thought about the Whitmore aviation facility he'd visited twice in the past 2 weeks, the hangars. The maintenance crews moving through their workday with the specific economy of people who'd learned to do their jobs without expecting anyone to notice. The pilot briefing room with the outdated weather displays and the training records. The board showed 3 captains overdue for their recurrent simulator checks. The aircraft with the pressurization item that was now grounded and disassembled in a maintenance bay. A team of specialists working through the actuator system with a methodical patience that had been, Ethan suspected, somewhat accelerated by his presence in the hangar looking over their shoulders. It's a mess, Ethan said, but it's the right kind of mess. Martinez nodded like that made sense, which it did, if you were the kind of person it made sense to. His last day at Meridian was a Thursday. Kowalski shook his hand again in the parking lot and said nothing else, which was the right thing. Two of the other mechanics, a pair of brothers named Ray and Dennis Okafor, who'd worked the night shift alongside Ethan for 2 years, gave him a card signed by the entire maintenance crew that contained, in Ray's handwriting, approximately 4 spelling errors and the sentence, "You're the best mechanic we ever worked with," and also the quietest, which Ethan read in the truck before driving away, and which he folded and put in the same pea pocket as Noah's Post-it note. He drove to the Whitmore aviation facility on Friday morning. He did not wear his Meridian coveralls. He wore his own clothes, dark jeans, a gray thermal shirt, work boots, because he didn't have a Whitmore uniform yet, and he wasn't going to show up in anything that suggested he was anything other than what he was, a person who had just started, with everything still to prove, and a lot of things to understand. The facility was on the north side of the Chicago Metro, a leased operation at a general aviation airport with 7 hangars, a dedicated fuel farm, a pilot and crew building that had been renovated about 8 years ago and not meaningfully updated since. Ethan had been here twice in the past 2 weeks for assessment visits, so the layout was familiar. Arriving as an employee rather than a visitor felt different in the specific way that all first days feel different, like you're wearing the space rather than observing it. The operations manager, a compact, efficient woman named Sandra Reyes, met him at the entrance. She'd been with Whitmore Aerospace for 6 years and had managed the flight operations facility for 3 of them. She was good at her job, in the same way that Harrison was a good pilot, thorough, reliable, capable within established systems. The problem was not Sandra Reyes. The problem was the system she'd been managing. "Ms. Whitmore asked me to facilitate your first week," Sandra said, walking him through the operations center. Her voice was professional, her face was carefully neutral, and Ethan recognized both as signs of someone who wasn't sure yet whether he was a threat or a resource. "I appreciate that," he said. "I want to spend the first week in the hangars." "Here," Sandra glanced at him. "In the hangars, with the maintenance crews. I'm not going to be useful in an office until I understand the physical state of the aircraft and the working culture of the people maintaining them. No," he said it plainly, not as a challenge. "I'd like to be introduced to the lead mechanic today." "What's his name?" "Her name," Sandra said, "Rosa Gutierrez. She's been here 9 years." "Good. I'd like to meet her this morning." Sandra's neutral expression shifted very slightly, not to warmth, exactly, but to something that was reconsidering its initial position. "I can arrange that." Rosa Gutierrez was 51 years old and had the forearms of someone who'd been doing physical mechanical work since her mid-20s, and the eyes of someone who'd been in this particular facility long enough to have a detailed, categorized understanding of exactly how much management actually cared about what happened in the hangars, which was to say, not much. Not in any way that showed up in salaries or resources, or the basic institutional acknowledgement that the aircraft didn't maintain themselves. She met Ethan in Hangar 3, where a mid-range business jet was in for a scheduled B-check inspection. She was in gray coveralls and safety glasses pushed up on her forehead, and she shook his hand with the grip of someone deciding something. "Director of Flight Operations," she said. Not skeptical exactly. Testing the phrase to see what it meant when she said it out loud. "That's the title," Ethan said. "You can call me Ethan." She looked at him. "What do you actually want from me?" He appreciated the directness. He'd been prepared for the alternative, a maintenance lead, who smiled and cooperated and told him everything was fine, and then went back to the actual reality once he left the hangar. Rosa Gutierrez was not that person. She was going to say the real thing, which meant he had to say the real thing back. "I want to know what you've been telling management for the past 3 years that management hasn't done anything about," he said. "And I want to see every aircraft that's currently in rotation, in person, with you walking me through anything you'd have flagged if you thought someone would listen." Rosa looked at him for a long time. "That's going to take more than one morning," she said. "I've got all week." She studied his face. Whatever she was looking for, sincerity, competence, the specific quality of attention that distinguishes someone who is actually going to do something from someone who is performing the intention to do something, she apparently found enough of it. "Hangar 4, she said, and turned and walked. "I'll start with the one that bothers me most." The aircraft in Hangar 4 was a Gulfstream G450, tail number N7741W, 12 years old, and currently in rotation for what was designated as low-priority charter work cargo runs, positioning flights, a handful of passenger segments that were contracted to other operators who used Whitmore aircraft on a wet lease basis. It had accumulated close to 14,000 flight hours, which wasn't extraordinary for a G450, but the maintenance history had some gaps in it that Rosa had been noting in her own records for about 18 months. There was an avionics update 18 months ago, Rosa said, standing in front of the aircraft's open nose bay. Routine, standard software package. The work was contracted out to an avionics shop that Ops approved because they were cheaper than our usual provider. Okay, Ethan said. The work was signed off correctly. All the paperwork is clean. She pointed to a component near the top of the bay, behind the primary radar antenna. But 3 months after the update, I started seeing intermittent discrepancies in the navigation crosscheck, thing that ever exceeded tolerance. Nothing that ever triggered a maintenance hold. Ethan leaned into the bay and looked at where she was pointing. How often, he said. On average, once every 6 flights. Sometimes more, sometimes less. The pilots log it. I look at it. The readings are within spec. I can't ground the aircraft on within spec readings. But it's the same type of intermittent that shows up before a component starts to go. Not always, but consistently enough that I started keeping a personal log of the instances, because I knew if I waited for it to fail, it would fail at the wrong time. She folded her arms. I flagged it to the previous operations director 8 months ago. I was told the readings were within spec and to continue monitoring. Ethan straightened up. He looked at the aircraft for a moment, the way he always looked at aircraft not as objects but as systems. Each component in conversation with every other component. The whole thing a single extended argument about physics and engineering and maintenance and time. Pull the avionics contractor's work order from 18 months ago, he said. I want to see exactly what they touched and what they didn't touch and compare it to the pre-update configuration. I've been trying to get that work order for 6 months. Why haven't you gotten it? The contractor's records are with the procurement office and I don't have authority to request them directly. My requests have to go through operations, and operations keeps losing the request, Ethan said. Keeps determining that a within-spec intermittent doesn't justify the administrative burden of pulling historical contractor records. Her voice was flat and precise and completely without self-pity, which made it more pointed, not less. Ethan pulled out his phone and called Sloane. She answered on the second ring. I need authority to pull contractor maintenance records from your procurement office directly, he said. Intermediary. And I need it now, not through a request process. A brief pause. Done. I'll have Sandra send you the authorization. Thank you. He hung up. Rosa was watching him. The authorization will be in your email by the time we get back to the operations center, he said. We're going to pull that work order today. What else have you been unable to get anyone to look at? Rosa looked at him for another long moment. Something behind her eyes shifted a wall that had been up for a long time deciding, carefully and not all at once, to come down a little. Come with me, she said. They spent 3 days in the hangars. 3 hours. 3 days. Ethan in work clothes, Rosa at his side or ahead of him, going through aircraft with the kind of attention that Rosa had been applying alone for 9 years, but had never been able to translate into action because she'd been reporting to people who were evaluating her concerns through a filter of schedule. Pressure and operating costs and the institutional momentum of an organization that had been measuring safety by the absence of accidents rather than the presence of actual safety conditions. The avionics contractor situation on the G450 turned out to be exactly what Rosa suspected. The update of her had introduced a configuration conflict with an existing navigation component that was outside the update specified scope, and the contractor either hadn't noticed or hadn't flagged it because it was technically outside their work order. The intermittent navigation discrepancy was a symptom of that conflict. The aircraft was grounded on day 1, and Ethan had the avionics shop that did the original update back on site to correct the conflict within 48 hours, which was accomplished only after a conversation with the shop's operations director. That was, by Ethan's measure, the least enjoyable phone call he'd made in recent memory. The pressurization issue on the other aircraft, the one he'd flagged from Sloane's records on the want-to-return flight from Washington, was more complicated. The disassembly team had found evidence of wear patterns on two seals that were inconsistent with the aircraft's overall usage cycle, which suggested the previous repair record had either used the wrong specification parts or UC has installed the correct parts incorrectly. Both possibilities required a full pressurization system overhaul. The aircraft stayed grounded. The timeline for return to service was 3 weeks minimum. There were smaller things, too. A hydraulic line on one aircraft that had been flagged for replacement twice and deferred twice, still within its service limit, but at the outer edge of it. Brake wear measurements on another aircraft that were logged at the minimum expectable threshold in the maintenance records, but that, when Ethan physically measured them on day 2, were below that threshold not dangerously, but enough that the discrepancy between the logged measurement and the actual measurement meant someone had either made an error or made a decision, and neither possibility was acceptable. He didn't make accusations. He documented. He asked questions. He had the discrepancies corrected, and he wrote a systems note that went to every maintenance team member explaining that measurements were to be recorded as found, not as desired, and that any measurement within 10% of a service limit was to be flagged for his personal review before being signed off. He wrote it in plain language, not disciplinary language. He was not trying to punish anyone. He was trying to change what normal looked like. Rosa walked with him through all of it. On the afternoon of the third day, they were sitting in the hangar break room, a room that contained a coffee maker, a folding table, 3 mismatched chairs, a whiteboard that someone had used to write the word safety first in large letters about 6 years ago and which had not been erased since, possibly because it would have seemed ironic. And Ethan was going through the week's documentation, while Rosa sat across from him with a coffee cup she'd stopped drinking from 20 minutes ago. "You're going to actually do this," she said. He looked up. "Do what?" "All of this." She gestured, a vague motion that encompassed the hangar, the aircraft the week they'd just spent, the documentation on the table in front of him. "Change it. That's the job." That's what the last 3 directors of flight operations said, in different words. She wasn't being cynical. She was being factual. The one before Sandra's time lasted 8 months. The one before him lasted 14. They both did some things. Neither of them. She paused, looking for the right word. Neither of them got in the bay. Ethan set down his pen. Did they ever come to the hangars? For walkthroughs. With management. Where we showed them things that were ready to be shown. She looked at him steadily. You showed up in your own clothes on the first morning and asked to meet me. Management. Me, he didn't say anything. I've been here 9 years, Rosa said. I've logged 412 discrepancy flags in my personal Dracketrans, things I noticed, and reported through official channels and watched get absorbed into with inspect determinations and deferred maintenance decisions. 412. She picked up her coffee cup, looked at it, put it down. 3 of them, if they'd developed into actual failures at the wrong moment, would have been catastrophic. Which 3? She told him. He recognized all 3 from the records he'd reviewed. The pressurization item, he said. Yes. And the hydraulic anomaly on the N3820. The one that got signed off as within tolerance 4 years ago. Yes, she looked at him. I was the one who flagged that one originally. I was told it had been reviewed and resolved. I accepted that. I put it in my personal log and I accepted it and I kept watching it. She paused. Nothing happened. The aircraft is still flying. The hydraulic system is fine. Maybe the review was right and I was wrong. But I didn't know that. I just knew nobody asked me. Ethan looked at the whiteboard. Safety first, 6 years old and never erased. Slowly yellowing at the edges the way markers always yellowed on whiteboards when nobody cleaned them properly. The anonymous reporting system goes live next week, he said. Your flags will have a formal channel. Everything logged, everything reviewed by me directly, everything with a documented outcome you can see. And if you get overruled on something, I won't. She looked at him. Sloane's terms, he said. Safety decisions are mine. Business override. You trust that. I trust that she understands what it costs if she breaks it. He said it without heat, just as an assessment. She's smart enough to know that the value of the arrangement is entirely in whether it's real. The moment she overrides a safety call for a business reason, she's back where she was before, except now she's got documentation that she knew better. Rosa sat with that for a moment. What about salaries, she said. Compensations review starts next week. I've already sent Sloane's HR team the market data. Lead mechanic rate in this region for your experience level should be 38% higher than your current rate. Rosa stared at him. That's the market rate, he said. You should have been making that 2 years ago. She was quiet for a long moment. Emotional, or rather, emotional, in the way that people who have been waiting a long time for basic professional respect are emotional when it finally shows up, which is not gratitude exactly, but something closer to the exhausted relief of someone who has been holding a very heavy thing. For so long they'd started to believe it was just part of their body. 38%, she said. Minimum, he said. Depending on what the full review shows. She nodded once. She picked up her coffee cup and drank from it, even though it was cold by now, and she looked at the hangar through the break room window, at the aircraft in their bays and the mechanics moving around them. And she said nothing else for a while, and Ethan went back to his documentation, and that was how the culture started to turn, not with a speech, not with a policy memo, with a rollout or a kickoff meeting or any of the institutional performances that organizations use to signal change without necessarily producing it, but with a lead mechanic drinking cold coffee in a break room, and, for the first time in 9 years, beginning to believe that the next flag she logged might actually go somewhere. Miles Barrett appeared at the facility on a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks into Ethan's time at Whitmore, carrying his flight bag and his training logbook and the careful posture of someone who has been told to report to a new supervisor and isn't entirely sure what that means for him. Ethan was in the briefing room reviewing weather data when Miles knocked on the open door. You wanted to see my training records, Miles said. Sit down, Ethan said. Miles sat. He put his logbook on the table. Ethan opened, spent 5 minutes reading through it in silence, which Miles endured with the discipline of someone who has learned that patience in briefings is a professional skill. The logbook was meticulous. Miles's entries were precise, complete, and consistently formatted the handwriting of someone who took documentation seriously. His flight time was building steadily. His instrument currency was current. His recurrent training was mostly current, with one exception. You're 11 days overdue for your G550 simulator check, Ethan said. It was scheduled for last month, but Harrison's hospitalization created a scheduling gap. And it's being rescheduled for next Tuesday. Chicago Simulation Center. I've already booked the slot. Miles blinked. That was fast. Was 11 days overdue. Ethan looked up from the logbook. How are you feeling about the approaches? The sim check includes a Category 3 ILS with a failed right engine on final. I've done that scenario. When? 14 months ago. In training. So you've done it, Miles held his gaze. Yes. We're going to run through it on paper before Tuesday. Because I think you can't do it. Because you should have done it more than once in 14 months, and that's not your fault. It's a training program gap, and I'm not sending you into a simulator check cold on a scenario you've only run once. He closed the logbook and pushed it back across the table. Monday afternoon, 3 o'clock. Bring your approach plates. Miles took the logbook. He held it for a moment. The other captains on the roster, he said carefully. Are you doing this with all of them? I'm reviewing all 14 training records this week. The 3 captains who are overdue for recurrent checks are being scheduled. The others are getting individual briefings on the areas where their log proficiency checks show gaps. He paused. Is that a Miles said? It's just... He stopped. Harrison ran good operations. He really did. But the attitude was, if you had your hours and your currency stamps, that was enough. Body looked at the actual flying. I'm looking at the actual flying now. Miles looked at him. I've been thinking about what you said on the approach into Dulles. Frequency economy. About practice economy. And I've been practicing it. The radio calls. I timed myself over a week. He pulled out his phone and showed Ethan a Notes app entry, a column of times, average radio call durations, with a trend line across the week showing gradual reduction. Ethan looked at it. It was the kind of thing you did when you were genuinely trying to get better, rather than trying to appear to be getting better, and there was a meaningful difference between those two things. That's good work, Ethan said. I want to be the kind of pilot you described, Miles said. He said it directly, without embarrassment, which took a certain kind of honesty. On the flight back from Washington, when you said great pilots are defined by discipline and judgment and humility, I want to be that. Ethan looked at him. You're already most of the way there, he said. The discipline is obvious. The judgment is developing. The humility, he paused. You sat in the right seat with a man in mechanic's coveralls who you'd never met, and you did your job correctly, and you kept your doubts to yourself. That's humility in practice, not just in principle. Was quiet for a moment. I had a lot of doubts. You did your job anyway. Ethan stood. Monday at 3. Miles stood too. He picked up his flight bag. He was at the door when he stopped. The wind shear, he said. Before Ohio. Have you always been able to do that? Ethan considered the question honestly. No, it takes a long time. And you have to be willing to be wrong about it sometimes. And still call it. Because the alternative is not calling it and being wrong about that. Nodded slowly. How do you know which wrong is worse? You don't always. But asymmetric risks are easier than they look. One wrong gets you a bumpy minute. The other wrong. He left the end of the sentence. Miles understood. The other wrong you don't get to learn from. Miles left. Ethan sat back down with the weather data. Sloane came to the facility twice in the first 3 weeks, not on scheduled visits, but unannounced, which Ethan found out later was deliberate. She'd told Garrett she wanted to see the place as it actually was, rather than as it would be arranged for a visit. The first time, she walked the hangars with Rosa for 40 minutes. Ethan wasn't there, he was at the simulation center, reviewing their equipment for the upcoming recurrent checks, and he learned about the visit from Rosa afterward. She asked good questions, Rosa said, and said it in a way that suggested she'd been prepared to report the opposite. What kind of questions? Technical ones. Not technical like she understood the answers, but technical like she was trying to understand what she didn't know rather than confirming what she thought she did. Rosa paused. She asked me what I wished management had known 3 years ago. I told her. She wrote it down. She wrote it down in a notebook by hand. Rosa seemed to find this significant. In a phone. In a notebook. The second visit, Sloane came while Ethan was in the briefing room doing the Monday session with Miles, going through the engine-out ILS scenario on paper before Tuesday's simulator check. She knocked on the open door, saw what was happening, and said she'd come back. And Ethan said it was fine. They were almost done, and she came in and sat at the back of the room and listened for 20 minutes without saying a word. Miles, to his credit, ignored her completely and focused on the approach plates, which was the right call. When they finished and Miles left, Sloane stayed. That approach scenario, she said. If a pilot fails that in the simulator, what happens? Remedial training. Repeat check. Depending on the failure mode, possible temporary suspension of type rating until the training is complete. Has anyone failed it? Not yet. The checks start this week. He gathered the approach plates. 2 of your captains haven't run the engine-out ILS scenario in simulation since their initial type ratings. That's a training program gap, not a pilot competence issue. We're correcting it, and if someone fails, we run the remedial training. That's what it's there for. He looked at her. The goal is not to find pilots who are already perfect. The goal is to identify gaps before the gaps show up at the wrong moment. She looked at the whiteboard. Ethan had written the approach sequence on it in his typical spare notation, all numbers and arrows, and no wasted text. She studied it for a moment. I've been reading the anonymous report submissions, she said, from the system that launched last week. He waited. Have been 47 submissions in 6 days, she said. 49 as of this morning. Most of them are small. Procedural concerns, scheduling complaints, equipment requests. She paused. But 7 of them described specific safety observations that should have been in the formal maintenance log in Ventus. He said, I've been following up on all 7. How many of those 7 were things Rosa Gutierrez already knew about? He looked at her. 5, Sloane absorbed that. 5 things that Rosa had known and logged in her personal records, and submitted through official channels and watched disappear into the silence of an organization that was better at looking safe than being safe. What do I need to understand, Sloane said carefully, about how that happened? Not who to blame. How the structure allowed it. It was, Ethan thought, the right question. The easiest question, but the right one. He pulled a chair out from the table across from him, and she sat down, and he spent 40 minutes explaining the mechanics of how safety culture deteriorates in organizations that measure the wrong things, how reporting systems become performative. When reporters learn their reports don't change outcomes, inspection standards drift when inspectors are evaluated on throughput rather than thoroughness. How the gap between documented reality and actual reality grows so gradually that nobody can point to the moment it started. Because it never started at a moment. It started as a direction. Sloane listened with the particular quality of attention she had, total, organized, processing what she heard in real time, and filing it into the structure of what she already understood. She asked 3 questions. They were good questions. The third one was better than the first 2. If you'd come here 3 years ago, she said, before any of this, before the pressurization issue, before the avionics conflict, before the training gaps, would you have seen what Rosa was seeing? Ethan thought about that honestly. I'd have seen some of it. The technical stuff, yes. The culture, maybe. Depends on whether I had the authority to act on what I saw. And if you didn't, then I'd have left. He said it plainly. Because I'm not willing to see problems and be unable to fix them. That's not a position I can occupy. She looked at him for a moment. That's a very honest answer. It seemed like the situation called for it. She almost smiled. It was brief and controlled, the expression of someone who is not in the habit of smiling freely, but it was there. The pressurization overhaul is on track for next week, Tuesday. The team has been good. We'll have the aircraft back in rotation by end of month with a clean bill. And the N7741W. Avionics conflict corrected, software reconfigured. Ground runs complete. I want 1 more day of systems monitoring before I sign the return to service. Does your gut say? It was the first time she'd asked for something other than a database assessment, and he recognized it as its own kind of progress. My gut says it's going to be fine, he said. But my gut also says I'm going to monitor it for 1 more day anyway. She stood up. She gathered her notepad, the actual paper notepad, which Rosa had apparently identified as characteristic, and she looked at the approach sequence on the whiteboard 1 more time. Ethan, she said. He looked at her. I've spent 2 weeks talking to Rosa, the maintenance teams, the pilots, and the sim center staff. She paused. Nobody not once has said, this is being done for appearances. That's unusual. In my experience, when management implements something, the people on the floor know within a week whether it's real or not. Because they're not teachers, he said. They know because they're not stupid, he said, and because they've seen for enough times to recognize the difference. What did you do that they recognized? He thought about it. I got in the bay, he said. Rose's phrase and the right one. Sloane nodded. She left. He looked at the whiteboard for a moment. Then he erased the approach sequence, picked his marker, and started writing the parameters for next week's pressurization test. Because the aircraft was going to be ready on Tuesday, and he needed to have the verification checklist prepared. And there was work to do, and the work didn't stop because a conversation had gone well. That was the thing about real work. It was continuous. There was no moment where you stepped back and declared it finished and accepted the acknowledgement. You fixed the thing, and then there was another thing, and you fixed that too. And on good days, the chain of things led somewhere, and on bad days, it didn't. You showed up either way, because the alternative was an aircraft with a problem, and people in the cabin who trusted that someone was paying attention. Ethan was paying attention. He wrote the checklist, put the cap on the marker, and went back to the hangars. The demonstration flight was scheduled for a Thursday in late April. 6 weeks, Ethan had walked into the Whitmore facility in his own clothes and asked to meet the lead mechanic instead of the operations director. 6 weeks sounds like a short time. It wasn't. Not the way those 6 weeks went. The government officials confirmed 11 days is out, a 4-person delegation from the Department of Transportation's Aviation Safety Division, accompanied by 2 senior staff from a Senate subcommittee on aerospace regulation. Whitmore Aerospace was competing for a long-term government contract that would formalize a partnership between private aviation operators and federal agencies for specialized transport needs. The demonstration flight was, in practical terms, an audition, just for the aircraft and the crew, but for the entire operating philosophy of the company. Sloane had told Ethan about the contract implications on a Tuesday evening in the briefing room after most of the staff had left. She'd laid it out plainly: the contract value, the evaluation criteria, the fact that the DOT delegations had specifically requested information about the company's safety management systems as part of the evaluation. If they ask about the safety reporting system, Ethan had said, tell them the truth, including the part where it didn't exist 6 weeks ago. Sloane had looked at him. That's not a standard approach to a government evaluation, but it's an accurate one. And accurate is more durable than polished. He'd paused. They're not evaluating whether you were perfect. They're evaluating whether you're trustworthy. Those are different things. She'd sat with that for a moment. Then she'd written something in her notebook. He didn't ask what. The week before the flight, Ethan pulled every aircraft in rotation for a final review. Because the previous inspections hadn't been thorough, they had, but because final review meant exactly that. Yes, he'd intervened, and he wasn't going to sign off on anything based on work done 3 weeks earlier without confirming that 3 weeks of operation hadn't introduced anything new. Rosa ran her team through the checks alongside him, and they worked with the kind of focused efficiency that emerges in a crew that has recently been given both the authority to do their jobs properly and the compensation that tells them their judgment is valued. It was still imperfect. Martinez flagged a brake wear measurement on the primary demonstration aircraft, the G550, the same aircraft Ethan had flown to Washington 6 weeks earlier, that was within tolerance but closer to the service limit than Ethan wanted with a government flight pending. The brake assembly required replacement. The parts were on order and arrived 48 hours later than expected because of a supplier logistics delay that nobody could control, which meant Rosa's team was doing the brake installation at 6 in the morning on the day before the demonstration flight, working under good lighting and with complete documentation, but also under the specific pressure of a deadline that could not move. Ethan was there for the installation. He didn't stand over anyone's shoulder. He made coffee and put it on the workbench and answered questions when they came and stayed out of the way when his presence wasn't needed. No. Because one of the things he'd learned over 4 years of being a mechanic and over 8 years before that of flying aircraft that other mechanics maintained was that a supervisor who stands behind people while they work communicates. Distrust, even when they mean to communicate support. You show trust by being present and then stepping back. You show distrust by hovering. Rosa signed off on the brake installation at 9:47 in the morning. Ethan reviewed her documentation, signed his own name beneath hers, and went to get more coffee. You're not going to check it yourself? One of the younger mechanics asked, accusatory, genuinely curious. Ethan looked at him. Rosa checked it. Do you think Rosa missed something? The mechanic thought about it. No. Then we're good. And got the coffee. The night before the flight, Noah asked if he could come to the airport to watch. They were eating dinner, actual dinner, not cereal. Because Ethan had made pasta with the jarred sauce that Noah preferred over the homemade version. He'd intervened, which Ethan found both baffling and endearing, and Noah had been uncharacteristically quiet through most of the meal, which usually meant he was working up to something. The thing tomorrow, Noah said. The flight with the government people. Can I come watch? Before school. I could be late, Mrs. Patterson would probably let me if you wrote a note. Looked at his son. Noah was 9 years old and sitting across the table with sauce on his chin and the particular expression of someone who has decided what they want and is trying to determine the correct strategy for obtaining it. Ethan asked. Shrugged, the one-shoulder shrug. I want to see you fly. Ethan set down his fork. In the 4 years since he'd stopped flying, Noah had never once asked to watch him do anything aviation-related. He'd come to Meridian once for a Bring Your Kid to Work event, and he'd been politely interested in the aircraft and the tools, and had asked Dave Kowalski 2 questions about fuel systems that were, by Kowalski's later account, better questions than most adults asked. But he'd never expressed particular interest in the flying itself. You've never asked about flying before, Ethan said. You didn't fly before, Noah said simply. Now you do. It was the kind of logic that was impossible to argue with, not because it was sophisticated, but because it was completely accurate. Departure is at 8, Ethan said. You'd have to be there by 7:15. I can do 7:15. I'll write the note. Noah went back to his pasta. He ate for a moment in his particular 9-year-old way, not fastidious, not messy, just eating, and then said without looking up, "Are you nervous?" Ethan considered the honest answer. A little. About the flight or about the people watching? About doing the job right, he said. Not about either of those other things specifically. Nodded. That makes sense. He ate another bite. Mrs. Daly says nervousness means you care about something. Mrs. Daly is right. She usually is. Noah wiped his chin with his sleeve, which Ethan noticed and didn't anything about because some battles were not worth the dinner they'd cost you. You're going to be good, Noah said. You're always good at the things you actually try at. Ethan looked at his son. He thought about how much of the past 4 years had been spent protecting Noah from the weight of something Noah had apparently been carrying an awareness of all along, not the details, not the guilt, Julian's name, and the specific shape of his absence, but the larger truth underneath it all, that his father was not entirely present, that there was a room in him with the door closed, that surviving for someone and being fully alive beside someone are two different things, and children can even when they can't name it. Thank you, Ethan said. Noah looked up. For what? For being patient with me. Noah thought about this seriously, the way he thought about most things. You were always there, he said finally. You also weren't. Sometimes. But you were always there. He shrugged. That's pretty good. It was, Ethan thought, a more generous assessment than he probably deserved. And it was offered without agenda, without resentment, without the weight of everything it could have carried, just a 9-year-old telling his father a true thing at the dinner table, sauce on his chin, the pasta cooling in the bowl between them. I'm going to be more there, Ethan said, from now on. Looked at him. I know, he said, like it was already settled, like he'd decided this some time ago and was just waiting for Ethan to catch up. April in Illinois is unreliable in ways that February at least has the decency to be consistent about. February is reliably bad. April is bad in ways that catch you off guard. A clear morning that turns to crosswind gusts by 10, a temperature that drops 15 degrees between breakfast and noon, a ceiling that was unrestricted at 7 and broken at 500 by 9. Ethan was at the facility at 5:45. He walked the aircraft first, in the early morning before the ground crews arrived, with a flashlight and the quiet. He went around the G550 the same way he'd gone around every aircraft he'd ever flown and touched the control surfaces, checking the gear doors, running the flashlight along the fuselage seams, looking at the brake assemblies Rose's team had installed the previous morning. The work was clean. The installation was correct. He'd known it would be, but he looked anyway, because that was the job, and the job didn't change based on how confident you were. He checked the weather. The forecast had shifted overnight. The morning would be clear, high pressure, holding, winds light and variable at the surface, minimal turbulence below 18,000. Above 18,000, a jet stream remnant was creating some wave activity that would produce moderate chop in the mid-20s. Manageable. The routing he'd planned would take them up through the smooth air, level at 33,000 where the jet stream was passed, and give the delegation 60 minutes of stable cruise before the return. He filed the amended flight plan at 6:15 and went to find coffee. Rosa was already in the hangar, which didn't surprise him. She was reviewing the brake installation documentation one more time, not because she doubted the work, but because she was a person who reviewed things, and always had been. And the difference now was that reviewing things felt like preparation rather than the performance of a responsibility. Nobody was watching. She looked up when Ethan came in. Brakes are good, she said. I know you know. She went back to her documentation. I'm just saying. He got his coffee from the crew room and stood in the hangar doorway for a while, looking at the pre-dawn dark outside. The airfield was quiet. A single white runway edge light visible from the hangar, blinking its slow rhythm at nothing in particular. He thought about the first time he'd flown a real aircraft, not a simulator, not a training rig, but an actual aircraft with actual sky outside the actual windshield. He'd been 22, a newly commissioned second lieutenant with approximately 300 hours in his logbook, The moment the wheels left the runway for the first time under his sole command, he'd experienced something that he'd never been able to accurately describe to anyone who hadn't felt it. Not excitement, not fear, something quieter than both of those. Something closer to the sensation of being exactly where you're supposed to be, doing exactly what you're supposed to be doing. A sensation so complete and so self-contained that it needed no external confirmation. He'd felt it again, on that February morning when the G550 lifted off the Meridian runway in the gray winter air, wheels releasing their grip on the tarmac, the whole world reorganizing into the configuration it took when you were no longer ground-bound. He was going to feel it again in about 2 hours. He finished his coffee, arrived at 7:12 with Mrs. Daly, who had driven him, because Ethan had been at the facility since before 6, and the school note was on the kitchen counter. Was in his school clothes with his backpack on, and his jacket unzipped, despite the April morning temperature. Yes, he'd intervened, and he walked into the hangar and looked at the G550 with the specific attention of someone who had been thinking about this moment and wanted to take it seriously. "That's it?" Noah said. "That's it," Ethan said. Noah walked slowly around the nose of the aircraft, not touching it, just looking. He stopped at the wing root and looked up at the engine nacelle and then back at Ethan. "It's bigger than I thought," he said. "Most things are." Looked at him. "Is Miles flying with you?" "Right seat." "Is he good?" "He's getting there," Ethan said, and meant it as the compliment it was. Mrs. Daly stood at the hangar entrance with a travel coffee mug, watching them with the expression of someone witnessing something they've been patiently waiting a long time to see. She caught Ethan's eye and raised her mug slightly. He nodded. Miles arrived at 7:20 with his flight bag and his approach plates, and his uniform pressed with the precision of someone who takes the appearance of competence as seriously as the competence itself, which was not a bad quality. He shook Noah's hand when Ethan introduced them, which he did correctly directly, without condescension, the way adults shake hands with children when they've decided to take them seriously. "Your dad says you're 9, Miles said. "Yes," Noah said. "When I was 9, I told my mom I was going to fly airplanes, and she said that was a nice dream." He looked at the G550. Turns out it wasn't just a dream. Noah considered this. "Did you always know you wanted to?" "Pretty much. My dad didn't tell me he could fly," Noah said. Not accusing, just noting the fact. Miles glanced at Ethan. Ethan said nothing. "Sometimes people know things about themselves that take a while to say out loud," Miles said. He'd intervened. It was a more sophisticated answer than Ethan expected from him, and he looked at Miles with something he would not have called surprise, but that was adjacent to it. Accepted this with the gravity of someone storing information for later use. The delegation arrived at 7:54 DOT officials and 2 Senate staff, driven in from their downtown hotel in a company car. They were cordial and professionally reserved, in the way people who evaluate for a living and have learned to withhold visible reaction until they've finished evaluating. Sloane met them at the facility entrance and walked them through the briefing room, where she gave a presentation that Ethan had reviewed 2 days earlier and suggested 3 changes to, all of which she'd incorporated. Yet intervened. The presentation was honest. It described where the safety management system had been 6 weeks ago, what had been found, what had been changed, and what the current state of operations was. It did not pretend that the organization had always functioned this way. It presented the change as what it was, a response to the recognition that the previous approach had been insufficient. One of the DOT officials, a gray-haired woman named Dr. Patricia Holt, whose title was Deputy Director of Aviation Safety Programs, asked, during the Q&A portion, why the previous safety officer's reports had not flagged the issues that the new director found in his first week. Sloane answered without deflecting, because the reporting structure created incentives to find the aircraft acceptable rather than incentives to find the truth about their condition. It was an organizational design failure, and it was mine to correct. Dr. Holt wrote something in her notebook. The other DOT officials exchanged a brief look that Ethan, standing at the back of the briefing room, read as the look of people who had expected a different kind of answer and were recalibrating. They boarded at 8:10. Ethan and Miles did the exterior pre-flight together. Ethan walking the left side, Miles the right, meeting at the tail and comparing observations. There was nothing to find. The aircraft was ready. In the cabin, The 6 delegation members settled into their seats. Sloane took the forward-most seat, facing aft, which put her closest to the cockpit, not because she needed to monitor the pilots, but because she wanted to be present for whatever happened, which Ethan had come to understand was simply how she operated. Stood at the bottom of the air stair with Mrs. Daly. Ethan paused at the top of the stairs. He looked down at his son, was looking back up at him, with his hands in his jacket pockets and his backpack still on, and his chin tipped up to keep Ethan in view, squinting slightly against the morning sun that had come up behind the hangar while they were briefing. Yes, he'd intervened. He looked like exactly what he was, a 9-year-old standing on an airport ramp, watching his father get ready to do something his father should have been doing for years. Ethan raised one hand. Noah raised both of his. It was not a dramatic gesture. There was no significance being performed. It was just a father and a son, communicating across a concrete ramp, the simple thing that parents and children communicate when one of them is about to go somewhere, and both of them know the other will be there when they return. I see you. I'll be back. Everything is as it should be. Ethan went up the stairs. He sealed the door. Chicago ground. More 777 Alpha at Hangar 7. Ready to taxi. IF Milwaukee with 1 stop. Request full route. The ground controller came back immediately, clear and precise, the specific efficiency of a controller who is good at the job. Taxi clearance to runway 27 right via taxiways Alpha, Delta, hold short of Delta 7. Miles read it back, perfectly clean, economical, no wasted words. Ethan noticed. He didn't say anything about it because there was nothing to say. The work spoke for itself. The G550 moved out of the ramp area with the unhurried certainty of a well-maintained aircraft being handled by someone who understood its weight. Ethan taxed without rushing, checking each taxiway intersection, holding where he was supposed to hold, moving where he was given clearance to move. The morning traffic was light, a corporate turboprop departing on the parallel runway, a cargo King Air inbound from the east, nothing that created complexity. At the hold short line for runway 27, right, Ethan ran the final before takeoff checks from memory, and then from the checklist, which was the correct order memory gets it done, the checklist catches what memory missed. Miles ran his items. They cross-checked. More 777 Alpha, runway 27 right, wind 260 at 8, cleared for takeoff. Ethan looked down the runway. 2,700 meters of concrete in the morning light, the overrun at the far end, a gray suggestion against the April sky. He thought about Julian for a moment, not the intercom voice. The last 14 seconds. Just Julian, the way he sat in a cockpit, loose and precise at the same time, the particular quality of attention he brought to the aircraft. The way he'd said once, during a debrief after a difficult test flight, the sky doesn't owe us anything, we just get to use it sometimes. It had seemed like a throwaway line at the time. Ethan had thought about it approximately 10,000 times since. He pushed the throttles forward. The Rolls-Royce engines answered with the sound he'd been hearing in the back of his mind for 4 years, the low-controlled surge of power that was nothing like anything else in the world, and the aircraft began to roll. Slowly at first, and then with gathering momentum, the runway lights strobing past in their steady intervals, the speed building through the numbers 60 knots, 8, 100, 110, and then Miles called rotate. And Ethan drew back on the controls with the specific pressure of long familiarity, and the nose rose and the main gear rumbled for a fraction of a second longer and then released, and the G550 was airborne. Clomseed intervened, climbing away from the runway into the April morning with the easy authority of a well-maintained aircraft flown by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The wheels retracted. The flaps came up in sequence. The aircraft climbed through 1,000 feet, 2,000, 4,000, the Illinois flatland spreading out below them in all directions, the city to the southeast, a gray and silver arrangement of towers in the morning light. At 8,000 feet, Chicago departure handed them off to Chicago Center, and the frequency was quiet, except for the occasional crisp exchange between controller and aircraft, and Ethan leveled the climb angle slightly to accommodate a traffic sequence, and then resumed climbing through 12,000 into the clearer air above. "Nice morning," Miles said. It was the first non-operational thing either of them had said since pushback. "Yeah," Ethan said. Miles looked at the horizon, the clean April sky ahead of them, the sun still low enough to throw long light across the top of the cloud layer below. "I've been flying for 4 years," he said, "and I still don't take this for granted." "Good," Ethan said. "Don't." They climbed through 20,000. The turbulence the forecast had predicted showed up at 22,000, a band of moderate chop that rocked the aircraft with the specific unpredictability of wave turbulence, not dangerous, not violent, but insistent. Ethan reduced the climb rate and flew through it with the same steady hand he'd used since rotation, not fighting the turbulence, not ignoring it, just maintaining the attitude and letting the aircraft do what well-designed aircraft do in moderate turbulence, which is absorb it. In the cabin, Sloane gripped the armrest for about 3 seconds and then let go and went back to her notes. Dr. Holt, the DOT deputy director, looked at the ceiling of the cabin during the worst of it and then back at her own notes. By 26,000, the chop smoothed. By 33,000, the air was as clear and still as the forecast had promised, and the G550 leveled off into cruise with the quiet confidence of a machine that had been properly cared for, doing exactly what it was built to do. Walkie center. More 777 Alpha, level 330. Miles said into the radio. Economical. No wasted words. The sky at 33,000 feet in late April is a specific color that doesn't exist at any other altitude, in any other season, not blue exactly. Something beyond blue. A depth of color that requires 40 miles of atmosphere between you and it to achieve, the kind of color that makes you understand, viscerally, that the sky is not a ceiling but a direction. Ethan looked at it. He thought about the first time he'd been at this altitude 19 years old, a passenger on a commercial flight to visit his grandmother in Phoenix, face pressed to the oval window, unable to understand how something so enormous could look so close. He thought about the first time he'd been here as a pilot, 22, second lieutenant, the particular sensation of being exactly where he was supposed to be. He thought about the last time, 4 years ago, the flight back from the Nevada facility after he'd cleared out his quarters, sitting in a coach seat on a commercial flight and deliberately not looking out the window because looking out the window hurt. He was looking at it now. He was not performing looking at it. Was not experiencing it as a metaphor for his own emotional recovery, or as a symbol of anything, or as the culmination of a journey. He was simply at 33,000 feet on a clear April morning in a properly maintained aircraft with a capable first officer in the right seat, and 6 government officials in the cabin, and a 9-year-old on an airport ramp 50 miles behind. Him with his backpack still on, and the sky was the color it was, and he was here, and it was enough. It was actually more than enough. The return approach was a long final into the facility, the morning sun now well up, and the shadows shortened on the runway surface, the city visible to the southeast in the clear air, everything precise and quiet and functioning as it should. The touchdown was firm. Ethan caught a gust in the last 100 feet that changed his energy calculation, and he managed most of it but not all of it, and the main gear made contact with a bit more authority than he'd aimed for. And Miles made a small note on his approach plate, and Ethan glanced at him, and Miles looked back steadily, and Ethan nodded once. That was the job. You aimed for perfect, and you got what you got, and you noted what needed noting, and you went back to work. They taxied clear of the runway, and back to the ramp in the same unhurried way they'd taxied out, and the G550 settled into its parking spot, and the engine spooled down in sequence, and the aircraft clicked and cooled around them. Systems going quiet one by one, and for a moment Ethan sat in the left seat in the cooling silence and did not move. Miles waited. Then Ethan shut down the remaining systems, removed his headset, set it on the glare shield and was still there. He was sitting on an equipment case near the hangar entrance with Mrs. Daly beside him, doing something on her phone, and when the air stair came down and the delegation emerged, Noah stood up and looked past all of them at the cockpit door. No. Came down the stairs. Noah walked toward him at a pace that was not quite a run, but with the specific velocity of a 9-year-old who has decided that dignity is less important than arrival, and Ethan met him halfway across the ramp and put a hand on the top of his head, which Noah tolerated for approximately 1 second before ducking out from under it. "How was it?" Noah asked. "Good," Ethan said. There was some turbulence in the mid-20s. "Was it cool?" Ethan looked at his son. He said, "It was pretty cool." Noah nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose prediction has been confirmed. He looked past Ethan at the G550 and, sitting on the ramp in the morning light with its engines cooling, the Whitmore logo on the tail, the windshield catching the sun. "Can I see the cockpit?" he said. Ethan looked at the aircraft. "Yeah," he said. "Come on." They went up the stairs together. Dr. Patricia Holt found Sloane near the hangar entrance about 20 minutes after the flight, while the rest of the delegation was being offered coffee inside the operations center. "Ms. Whitmore," Holt said. She was direct, the manner of someone who had spent 30 years in regulatory work and had lost patience for preamble sometime around year 15. The flight was excellent. The aircraft performed well. "Your crew is professional." "Thank you," Sloane said. "More importantly," Holt continued, "your presentation this morning was the most honest safety self-assessment I've received from a private operator in 11 years in this position." She paused. "Operators show us what they've built. You showed us what you found and what you had to tear down to build it." Sloane was quiet for a moment. "We were advised that honesty was more durable than polish." Holt looked at her. "Your new director?" "Yes." Holt glanced toward the hangar, where Ethan were visible in the cockpit of the G550, Noah sitting in the left seat, Ethan beside him pointing at various instruments, the posture of someone explaining something to someone who genuinely wants to understand. "How long has he been in aviation?" 14 years, Sloane said. "He took 4 years away from it. Why'd he come back?" Sloane watched Ethan in the cockpit for a moment. "Someone challenged him to," she said. She said it with the specific dryness someone accepted their own role in a story that did not go the way they initially anticipated. Holt made a sound that might have been amusement. "The contract evaluation will take 60 days. But informally," she paused, "what you've built here in 6 weeks is more substantive than what some operators build in 6 years. Keep going in this direction." She went back inside. Sloane stood on the ramp alone for a moment in the April morning. The sky was still the clear, deep blue it had been at altitude. You could see that blue from the ground on days like this. No, though it took the full atmosphere to fully appreciate it. She thought about a hangar in February, and a man in grease-stained coveralls, and her own voice saying, "Fly this jet," in front of a dozen people like it was a dare. She had meant it as a test of something. She still wasn't sure exactly what competence, maybe, or boldness, or her own ability to make decisive judgments quickly. She had been testing entirely the wrong thing. What she'd actually done, without knowing it, was give a man who'd been standing in a closed room for 4 years a reason to open the door. She wasn't sure you could plan that. She wasn't sure it happened any other way. In the cockpit of the G550, Noah sat in the captain's seat with his hands on the control column and looked out at the ramp through the windshield with the unguarded attention of a child experiencing something genuinely new. "This is what you see?" he said. "When we're moving, there's a lot more happening," Ethan said. "Weather displays, traffic, radio calls. It gets busy. When it's quiet, yes, more or less like this." Looked at the horizon bar on the attitude indicator, at the altimeter, at the navigation display, dark and dormant on the ground. He touched the control column carefully, not pushing it, just resting his hands on it. "Do you like it?" he asked. Ethan looked at the windshield, at the ramp in the morning light, at the sky beyond the far fence of the airfield, the April blue continuing in every direction without apparent end. He said, "I do." "More than the mechanic stuff?" "Different," Ethan said. "Both matter. The mechanic stuff is what makes the flying real. If nobody's down in the bay doing the work, none of this happens." He paused. "I spent 4 years in the bay because I needed to understand that. I don't regret it." Noah considered this with the gravity he brought to things that seemed to him to be important. "Both," he said. "Both," Ethan agreed. Noah looked out the windshield for another minute. Then he turned to his father with the specific look that preceded a 9-year-old's considered opinion delivered with the full weight of 9 years of observation. Said, "You should have done this sooner." Ethan looked at his son. "Yeah," he said. "You're probably right." "It's okay that you didn't," Noah added, with the particular generosity of someone who has decided that being right is less important than being fair. "You had stuff to figure out." "I did." "Is it figured out now?" Ethan sat for a moment in the left seat of the aircraft he'd flown that morning, with his son beside him and the April sky through the windshield and the sound of the facility going about its ordinary business beyond the cockpit glass. Rose's voice somewhere in the hangar, directing her team. Miles in the briefing room, he suspected, already reviewing the flight notes from his approach plate. Sloane on the ramp, talking to the delegation, doing the work of rebuilding the thing she'd nearly allowed to deteriorate beyond repair. All of it imperfect, all of it in progress, all of it real. He thought about Julian not with guilt, and not with the performed absence of guilt that sometimes replaces it when you're trying too hard to be healed. Just with the plain, clean grief of missing someone who was gone, the grief that doesn't require a story about fault or causation, the grief that is simply the shape left by the person who used to be there. It hurt. It was supposed to hurt. It would keep hurting, the way all real law says, keep hurting. Quieter over time, but never entirely absent. Because the alternative not hurting would mean Julian hadn't mattered, and Julian had mattered enormously. But the guilt was gone, and without the guilt, the grief was something he could carry, something human-sized, something that could exist alongside everything else without consuming it, Ethan said. Noah nodded. He looked at the windshield one more time. Then he got up from the captain's seat with the careful deliberateness of someone treating it with respect, and he went to the cockpit door. He stopped, he said. Yeah, I'm glad you fly. Ethan looked at his son in the cockpit door, backpack still on, jacket still unzipped, 9 years old and entirely himself, completely unaware of how much weight those 4 words were carrying or how far they'd traveled to land. Me too, Ethan said. Noah went down the air stair. Ethan sat in the left seat for one more moment, alone in the cockpit, the way he'd sat in it in dullest that February afternoon, after the Washington flight. Because he needed to be there, but because the cockpit was where some things became clear that couldn't become clear anywhere else. He didn't need clarity right now. Everything was already clear. He just wanted one more minute of it, the way you stay at a table a little longer after a good meal. Not because you're still hungry, but because the table is a good place, and you're not in a hurry to leave it. 1 minute. Then he got up, hung his headset on its hook, and walked out of the cockpit into the rest of his life, which was in all its imperfection, its ongoing difficulty, its daily requirement of showing up and doing the work, even when the work was unglamorous, its complete and irreversible ordinariness, exactly where he was supposed to be. The grease-stained mechanic that everyone had laughed at in February was running a flight operation in April. The pilot who'd spent 4 years believing he'd caused his best friend's death had read 40 pages of investigation findings and understood, finally, that grief and guilt are not the same thing and do not have to be carried together. The single father who'd closed the window against the sound of approaching aircraft had opened it, and the sound was exactly what it had always been, aircraft descending through the dark toward the lights of the runway, engines at idle, the whole enormous machinery of flight resolving itself into the simplest possible action, coming home. Nothing remained unfinished. Ethan Mercer walked out of the hangar into the April morning, and his son was waiting, and the sky was the color it always was when the air was clear, and he looked up at it without flinching. He'd never stopped being a pilot. He just needed 6 weeks, and 1 arrogant challenge and 4 years of working with his hands, and 1 9-year-old who cut his sandwich diagonally, and a lead mechanic who kept 412 personal safeties law, and a first officer who timed his radio calls, and a retired colonel in Arizona who'd held a phone number for 4 years without calling, and 63 pages of investigation findings. And one February morning when someone pointed at a jet and said, "Fly this," and he said okay, he just needed all of that to remember it. He looked at the sky. He was home,